Long before the marble temples of Athens gleamed beneath the sun, before the philosophers spoke of truth and logic, there were the islanders of the Aegean, a people who lived between sea and stone. They were the first Greeks, though they did not yet call themselves so. To the south, on the island of Crete, the Minoans built palaces that shimmered like mirages above the sea. Their halls were painted with images of dolphins, bull leapers, and spirals of life, signs of a people who loved movement, color, and the pulse of the world around them. They had no need for fortresses. The sea was their wall, and trade was their weapon. Their ships, carved sleek and swift, glided from harbor to harbor, carrying olive oil, ceramics, and copper across the Aegean and beyond. To them, the world was a network of islands tied together by waves and wind. Their capital, Knossos, was more than a city. It was a labyrinth of courtyards and stairways, painted columns, and hidden chambers. Some said that within its walls dwelled the Minotaur, the beast born of human pride and divine punishment. Whether myth or memory, the story speaks of a people who believed their lives danced on the edge between gods and men. Yet across the mainland, another people watched, the Mycenaeans. Unlike the gentle traders of Crete, they were warriors. Their cities crowned the hills of Greece like stone helmets, fortified with walls so vast that later generations would call them Cyclopean, built by giants. They carved gold masks for their dead, buried their kings with weapons, and sang of honor and vengeance. Their greatest treasure was not gold, but pride. In their language, in their arms, we hear the first echoes of what would become the Greek spirit, fierce, restless, and unyielding. It was from this blend, the artistry of Crete and the fire of Mycenae, that Greece would be born. The Minoans gave Greece its grace. The Mycenaeans gave it its glory. Together, their legacies forged the balance that would define the Hellenic soul, the harmony between beauty and strength. But no civilization lasts forever. Around 1200 BCE, a shadow swept across the Aegean. Palaces burned, trade collapsed, and the world of kings fell silent. The Mycenaeans vanished into myth, leaving behind ruins and songs. For nearly 4 centuries, Greece entered what historians would call its Dark Age, a time of forgetfulness, when writing was lost and the sea grew quiet. Yet, in that silence, something new began to take shape. Stories whispered by the fireside, of heroes, of wars, of gods who walked among mortals, were passed down through generations. These stories would one day become the Iliad and the Odyssey, the twin flames that would light the Greek world once more. The Mycenaean kings were gone, but their memory endured, not as rulers, but as legends. And in those legends, the spirit of Greece began to awaken again. Out of the ashes of the forgotten age, a new dawn began to break across the mountains and coasts of the Aegean. Villages that once clung to survival began to grow, not into kingdoms ruled by a single hand, but into communities bound by shared purpose, shared pride, and shared destiny. The Greeks called these communities polis, city-states, and each one was like a living being with its own heart, spirit, and soul. There was Athens, where thought was freedom and speech was sacred. There was Sparta, where discipline was life and courage was law. Corinth, with its gleaming harbors and merchants rich from trade. Thebes, strong and stubborn, and Delphi, the mystical navel of the world where Apollo's oracle spoke in riddles. None of these cities thought themselves lesser than the other. They were rivals, reflections of the same restless soul that defined the Greek world. It was here that a new kind of human life began, one where a man was not merely a subject, but a citizen. In Athens, people gathered in open assemblies, under the clear sky, to debate, to argue, to decide their own fate. Democracy, fragile, imperfect, and revolutionary, was born not from peace, but from necessity, from a people who believed that power should not rest in bloodlines, but in words. And in those words, Greece found its voice. Yet freedom was not uniform. In Sparta, the polis took another form, not of open debate, but of unity through discipline. Boys were taken from their mothers at 7, raised to be soldiers of the state, bound to service, honor, and death if needed. While Athens built statues, Sparta built warriors. While Athens questioned, Sparta obeyed. Two visions of human greatness, one of mind, one of body, stood face to face across the mountains of the Peloponnesus. And between them stretched hundreds of smaller polis, each fiercely independent, each a spark in the constellation of Greek civilization. What united them was not empire or king, but language, faith, and the sea. They spoke the same tongue, worshipped the same gods, Zeus upon Olympus, Athena of wisdom, Poseidon of the sea, and shared the same stories of heroes and monsters that shaped their identity. But what truly bound them was something deeper, a belief that human beings, through reason and courage, could achieve greatness. In the agora, the marketplace, ideas flowed like rivers. Poets recited verses under the open sun. Philosophers debated the meaning of virtue and truth. Craftsmen shaped marble into perfection. The city became a stage, and every citizen, in his own way, an actor in the grand play of civilization. It was a fragile harmony, beauty resting on a knife's edge. For though the Greeks were bound by kinship, they were also divided by pride. Each polis saw itself as the center of the world, and conflict brewed beneath the calm surface. The age of heroes had given way to the age of men, and men, as Greece would soon learn, were just as capable of greatness as they were of ruin. The dawn that had brought light to Greece now shimmered with danger. Across the eastern horizon, beyond the glittering waters of the Aegean, a shadow was rising, the vast and powerful Persian Empire. From the deserts of Iran to the plains of Anatolia, Persia ruled through gold and iron, an empire of kings and satraps, armies and tribute. Its ruler, King Darius I, sought not only wealth but order, to bring the unruly Greeks into his dominion as he had so many others. It began quietly, almost inevitably. The Greek cities of Ionia, on the coast of Asia Minor, had long lived under Persian control, but the Greek spirit, even in foreign lands, could not bear the yoke of submission. They rebelled, calling to their mainland kin for aid. Athens, still young and hungry for glory, answered that call. They sent ships, soldiers, and hope. The rebellion failed, but it lit a fire that would soon engulf the world. Darius vowed revenge. He would teach Athens the cost of defiance. In 490 BCE, Persian ships darkened the sea, carrying thousands of soldiers to the plains of Marathon, not far from the city itself. The Athenians, outnumbered and untested, faced an army forged in conquest. Yet, under Miltiades, they did the unthinkable. They charged. Bronze met flesh, dust rose like smoke, and by day's end, the Persians were broken. From that field, a runner was sent to Athens to bring the news. We have won. He fell dead upon arrival, but his message would echo for eternity, the first marathon of legend and of courage. But Persia did not forget. A decade later, Darius's son Xerxes returned, bringing with him a force so vast it seemed to darken the earth. Tens of thousands of men marched. Fleets of ships shadowed the coast, the greatest army the world had ever seen. And before them stood Greece, small, divided, defiant. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a few hundred Greeks, led by King Leonidas of Sparta, stood against the tide. For 3 days, they held the line, bronze shields gleaming, spears unbroken, the enemy crashing like waves upon a rock. Come and take them, Leonidas had said when ordered to lay down his arms. And when they fell not in defeat, but in immortality. The world remembered. The Persians swept through Greece, burning Athens to the ground. But from the ashes, the Greeks struck back. At Salamis, Athenian ships lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits, where their size became their doom. Fire and chaos filled the water. Oars broke, hulls splintered, and the sea burned with oil and flame. The might of Persia shattered upon the cunning of Greece. And as dawn rose over the smoldering waters, a new truth emerged. Greece, though small, had defeated the greatest empire on earth, not by power, but by will. The victory was not merely military, it was spiritual. It told the world that freedom, that fragile, stubborn flame, could burn brighter than tyranny. But in that triumph lay the seed of something darker. For now Greece had seen what it could do, and soon it would turn its power not against kings from afar, but against itself. The smoke of war had scarcely faded when a new dawn rose over the Aegean. The golden age of Athens, a time when marble and mind alike were shaped into wonders that would echo through eternity. The city, scarred yet unbowed from the Persian wars, stood now as the heart of a new idea, that men could rule themselves, debate their destiny, and build beauty not for kings, but for the people. Upon the rocky height of the Acropolis, they would carve their dream in stone. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens transformed into the radiant jewel of Greece. He was no tyrant, no conqueror, but a statesman of vision, eloquent, calculating, and unshakably devoted to his city. "We do not imitate others," he declared. "We are the model to others." And so it was. Temples rose where ashes had been. Streets filled with philosophers, sculptors, playwrights, and orators. The city became a living work of art, where even the act of thinking was revered as sacred. At the heart of this transformation stood the Parthenon, a temple to Athena, goddess of wisdom and protector of the city. Its marble columns gleamed in the sunlight, precise and balanced as a thought from the mind of the gods. Within it stood a colossal statue of Athena, gold and ivory, her gaze serene yet unyielding, a reflection of Athens itself. Around her, the city thrived, humming with the rhythm of creation. The Agora, Athens' bustling marketplace, was not merely a center of trade but a cradle of ideas. There, citizens debated politics, ethics, and the meaning of life itself. Men like Socrates walked its dusty paths, questioning everything: gods, justice, and even the nature of knowledge. His relentless pursuit of truth would plant seeds that would one day grow into the entire tree of Western philosophy. The arts, too, flourished. The playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides filled the open-air theaters with tales of tragedy and triumph, of human pride and divine will. Their words cut deep, revealing the fragile balance between fate and freedom. Sculptors gave stone the breath of life, faces that felt, bodies that moved with grace and power. Historians like Herodotus and Thucydides began to capture not myth, but memory, the real, complex story of human struggle. And through it all, democracy, the grand experiment, pulsed at the city's core. In the ecclesia, citizens gathered to decide matters of war, law, and policy. Every man had a voice, every voice had weight. Yet, beneath this brilliance, shadows lingered. Slaves toiled unseen, women were denied a say in public life, and the wealth that sustained Athens often came from the tribute of its allies. The same democracy that preached equality thrived on inequality. Still, the vision was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was a civilization of thinkers and builders, poets and warriors, a place where the human spirit soared higher than the marble spires of its temples. And though this golden age would not last, its light would never fade. Athens had become more than a city, it was an idea. And ideas, unlike empires, do not die. For nearly half a century, the Aegean had glimmered with peace, fragile, uneasy, but radiant with the prosperity Athens had brought to the Greek world. Its navy ruled the seas, its democracy inspired envy, and its silver-filled coffers echoed with the hum of power. But where there is glory, there is also resentment. To the south, Sparta, the austere warrior state, watched Athens' growing arrogance with silent fury. Where Athens prized words and art, Sparta revered silence and discipline. Where one built walls of marble, the other built walls of men. Between these two visions of Greece, a storm was gathering. The tension was not born overnight. The Delian League, originally formed as a mutual alliance against Persia, had become an empire in disguise. Athens controlled its members with tribute and force, turning allies into subjects. The Spartans, proud and wary, saw this as an affront to Greek freedom. When minor disputes between their allies erupted, both powers found themselves drawn into conflict, a conflict that would last nearly 30 years and consume the soul of Greece. The war began in 431 BCE, a clash not of kings, but of ideologies. Athens fought with its fleets, swift and cunning, striking coastal cities and cutting supply lines. Sparta marched on land, its hoplites, men of iron and obedience, devastating the Attic countryside. The people of Athens retreated behind their long walls, trusting their navy and their leader, Pericles, to outlast the siege. Yet even the greatest minds could not command fate. A plague swept through the crowded city, a silent invader deadlier than any Spartan spear. It struck rich and poor alike, sparing neither soldiers nor scholars. The dead lay unburied in the streets, and with them died the confidence of a people who once believed themselves favored by the gods. Pericles himself succumbed, and with his death, Athens lost not just a leader. It lost its balance, its restraint, its moral compass. The war dragged on, shifting tides and loyalties. Alliances broke, cities rebelled, and betrayal became as common as battle. The brilliant Alcibiades, a man of ambition and charisma, rose and fell, changing sides like a shadow in the wind. First an Athenian hero, then a Spartan advisor, then a Persian ally. His story mirrored the war itself, dazzling, treacherous, tragic. By 404 BCE, Athens stood defeated. Its walls were torn down, its navy surrendered, its empire gone. Sparta had won, but Greece had lost. The once golden land of philosophers and artists now lay fractured and exhausted, its faith in itself shattered. The Peloponnesian War had not been fought for survival, but for dominance. And in that pursuit, Greece destroyed the very thing that made it great, its unity. Yet, even as the fires of war cooled, from the ashes rose new voices, thinkers who questioned the meaning of justice, power, and virtue. The collapse of Athens gave birth to a deeper introspection, a search for truth that would echo for centuries through the words of Plato and Aristotle. For though Athens had fallen, its spirit had not. The marble had cracked, but the idea endured, that wisdom and reason could still guide humanity, even through its darkest hour. While Athens and Sparta tore each other apart, a quiet storm gathered in the northern frontier, Macedon, a land of forests, mountains, and iron-hearted warriors. To the southern Greeks, Macedon was a backwater, a rough land of kings and clans rather than philosophers and poets. Yet in its rugged soil grew something Greece had lost: unity, discipline, and ambition. And from that soil rose Philip II, a man of vision sharper than any spear. Philip had been a hostage in Thebes in his youth, where he learned the art of Greek warfare and diplomacy. When he returned home, he found his kingdom fractured and threatened by enemies. But where others saw ruin, Philip saw opportunity. He reorganized the army, arming his soldiers with long spears, sarissas, and drilling them into a perfect machine of precision and power. The Macedonian phalanx moved like a living wall of bronze, unstoppable and terrifying. Within years, Philip subdued his rivals, forged alliances through marriage and cunning, and turned Macedon into the most formidable power in Greece. One by one, the city-states fell under his influence. Some joined willingly, seeing in Philip a chance for peace and stability. Others, like Athens, resisted and paid dearly for their defiance. In 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's army crushed the united Greek forces, ending centuries of independence. On that battlefield, a young prince fought by his father's side, Alexander, barely 18, already fierce and brilliant. To the Greeks, defeat was bitter. Their democracies humbled, their freedom curtailed. But Philip did not wish to destroy Greece. He sought to unite it under his banner for a greater purpose: the conquest of Persia, the empire that had once threatened them all. He envisioned a pan-Hellenic crusade, a war of vengeance and glory. The dream, however, would not be his to fulfill. In 336 BCE, Philip was struck down, assassinated at a festival, his blood staining the very land he had united. Whispers spread like fire through the courts of Macedon. A jealous rival, a scorned lover, perhaps even his own son. History remains silent on the truth. But what followed was something no one could have foreseen. The throne passed to Alexander, barely 20, yet already commanding the loyalty of hardened soldiers and the fear of seasoned generals. His charisma was electric, his intellect unmatched, his ambition boundless. To him, the world was not a collection of kingdoms, but a single horizon waiting to be conquered. Under his command, the disciplined armies of Macedon would march farther than any Greek army before them. Eastward, beyond the mountains of Anatolia, beyond the mighty rivers of Persia, and into the edges of the known world. Alexander sought not merely to defeat, but to become legend. As Greece looked upon this young king, some saw salvation, others madness. But none could deny that the winds of destiny had shifted. The age of the city-states had ended. The age of empire had begun. When the sun rose over Macedon after Philip's death, it shone upon a boy who would soon command the world. Alexander III of Macedon, barely 20, educated by Aristotle, inspired by Homer, and driven by a divine sense of destiny. He believed himself chosen, not by birth alone, but by fate. His heart burned with visions of Achilles. His sword carried the weight of his father's unfulfilled dream to conquer the mighty Persian Empire. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, leading an army of 30,000 men. As his feet touched the Asian shore, he threw his spear into the sand and declared the land a gift from the gods. To his men, it was madness. To Alexander, it was prophecy. The world, he said, would remember this day. The Persians met him with vast armies, their empire stretching from Egypt to India. Yet Alexander's genius was not in numbers, but in movement, in speed, deception, and the precise choreography of war. At the Battle of Granicus, he led the charge himself, plunging into the river, cutting through enemy ranks, his horse Bucephalus surging beneath him like a beast born of thunder. By sunset, the Persians were broken, and Asia Minor lay open before him. City after city fell, Sardis, Halicarnassus, and then Gordium, where he faced the legendary Gordian knot. The oracle had said that whoever untied it would rule the world. Alexander looked upon the knot, smiled, and sliced it clean in half with his sword. "It is the same," he said. Whether by patience or by strength, the world would bend to his will. In 333 BCE, he met the Persian king Darius III at Issus. Outnumbered yet unstoppable, Alexander struck like lightning. The Persians fled, and Darius' own family was captured. Alexander treated them with honor, a gesture that revealed both his cunning and his charisma. He was not merely a conqueror, he was a ruler in the making. From there, he marched south, through Syria and Phoenicia, besieging the island fortress of Tyre for 7 relentless months. His engineers built a causeway across the sea, stone by stone. When dawn broke over Macedon, a new sun rose with it. Alexander, the son of Philip and Olympus, the man destined to carve his name into eternity. From his earliest years, he was different, restless, brilliant, and unyielding. Taught by the philosopher Aristotle, he learned of logic, ethics, and the boundless world beyond Greece. But Alexander was no mere thinker. His blood burned for action. Legends say that when he first heard of his father's conquests, he wept, not out of joy, but because there would be no worlds left for him to conquer. At just 20 years old, Alexander ascended the throne. Enemies closed in from all sides, rebellions at home, whispers. In 334 BCE, Alexander led his army east across the Hellespont, the narrow strait that divided Europe from Asia. As his feet touched the foreign shore, he cast a spear into the soil and declared it conquered by right of his will. Ahead lay the Achaemenid Empire, a vast and glittering colossus stretching from the Aegean to India. It was the mightiest realm the world had ever seen. Yet Alexander, with barely 40,000 men, intended to bring it to its knees. His first great test came at the Battle of the Granicus River, where the Persian satraps lined the far bank with cavalry. Alexander led the charge himself, his horse Bucephalus roaring through the water as arrows darkened the sky. Against all odds, he triumphed. City after city fell before him: Sardis, Ephesus, Miletus, each taken not just with force, but with strategy and mercy. He spared the conquered, rewarded the loyal, and presented himself not as destroyer, but as liberator. Then came Issus in 333 BCE. Facing him was Darius III, king of kings, commanding an army that dwarfed Alexander's. The plains ran red with blood as Alexander's phalanx advanced in perfect formation. At the height of the battle, he saw Darius across the chaos and charged straight for him. The Persian king fled, abandoning his family and treasures. The world trembled. Egypt welcomed him as a god. He founded Alexandria, the city that would become a beacon of knowledge for centuries. From there, he crossed into Mesopotamia, where the final confrontation loomed: Gaugamela. Darius had assembled a colossal army, determined to crush the upstart Macedonian once and for all. But Alexander's tactics were brilliance incarnate. He broke the Persian line, shattered their cavalry, and sent Darius fleeing once more. In that moment, the ancient empire of Persia, the eternal rival of Greece, fell. Alexander stood at the height of power, ruler of a realm that stretched across continents. But it was not enough. His eyes turned farther east, toward. By the time Alexander's armies reached the easternmost provinces of Persia, the world behind them had already been reshaped. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, all had fallen to his will. Gold from Asia flowed into his coffers, and ambassadors from distant lands came to kneel before him. Yet victory had done something strange to the young conqueror. The fire that once burned with purpose now glowed with something darker, a hunger that could never be satisfied. Alexander began to see himself not merely as a king, but as something more, a being touched by the divine. He traced his lineage to Zeus and the heroes of myth. When he entered Egypt, the priests of Ammon hailed him as the son of a god. For some, it was blasphemy. For others, destiny. For Alexander, it was confirmation of what he had always believed, that the world itself existed to be shaped by his hand. But even the gods must face the limits of men. In 327 BCE, Alexander crossed the towering Hindu Kush, leading his weary soldiers into the Indian subcontinent, a land of monsoons, rivers, and kingdoms as strange as they were rich. Here, he faced the Rajas, rulers who commanded war elephants and armies unlike any he had seen. His most famous battle came at the Hydaspes River, against King Porus, a towering warrior said to ride upon an elephant as grand as a fortress. The river swelled with rain and blood. The elephants charged, trampling men beneath their feet as spears shattered against their hides. For hours, the air was filled with thunder and screams. But Alexander's discipline triumphed once more. Porus was captured, and when asked how he wished to be treated, the defeated king simply said, "Like a king." Moved by his courage, Alexander spared him, restored his lands, and called him brother. Even in conquest, respect endured. Yet the victory brought no joy. His soldiers, hardened by years of endless marching, torn from their homes, began to murmur. They had marched from Greece to the edge of the known world, through deserts and mountains, across rivers they had no names for. And now, standing before the vast and untamed lands beyond the Indus, they refused to go farther. Exhaustion broke their loyalty. Alexander raged. He pleaded, threatened, and promised riches beyond imagining. But his men stood silent. For the first time, the conqueror met defiance not from an enemy, but from his own. In the end, he relented. His dream of reaching the ends of the earth would remain unfulfilled. With sorrow, he turned back toward Babylon, leading his army through the harsh deserts of Gidroja, where thousands perished from thirst and heat. The man who had once defied the impossible now felt the slow erosion of mortality. When Alexander returned to Babylon, he was a shadow of himself, thinner, harder, his eyes distant. He began to drink heavily, holding lavish banquets where laughter masked unease. The gods had given him everything: victory, glory, immortality, yet denied him peace. Then, in 323 BCE, the young king fell ill. Fever consumed him for days. His generals waited for his orders, but Alexander could no longer speak. When asked who should inherit his empire, he whispered only, "To the strongest." At 32, the world's greatest conqueror was gone. His empire, vast and magnificent, would soon fracture into chaos. But his legend, the myth of Alexander, would never die. The news of Alexander's death spread like a shockwave through his empire, a realm so vast that the message itself took months to reach its edges. In Babylon, soldiers wept beside his body. In Greece, old rivals breathed in disbelief. And in the Far East, where his banners still fluttered above strange lands, the silence of uncertainty fell heavy. The man who had united the world under one vision was gone, and with Alexander had left no clear heir. His only son, Alexander IV, was born after his death, and his generals, the Diadochi, men who had once sworn loyalty to him, now turned their eyes toward power. They were warriors of extraordinary ability and towering pride: Ptolemy, the cunning strategist; Seleucus, the ambitious tactician; Antigonus, the iron-willed veteran; Cassander, the calculating politician. Each believed himself the rightful successor. Each was willing to bathe the world in blood to prove it. The empire splintered. What had been one realm became many, kingdoms carved by ambition and greed. In Egypt, Ptolemy took the throne, founding a dynasty that would endure for 3 centuries and give birth to Cleopatra, the last pharaoh. In Asia, Seleucus forged the Seleucid Empire, stretching from Syria to Persia. In Macedon, Cassander seized power, crushing rivals and claiming the homeland of Alexander himself. And Antigonus, defiant to the last, tried to rebuild the empire, only to fall in battle, his dreams buried beneath the dust of Ipsus. Though the unity of Alexander's empire died, his legacy lived on, not in borders, but in ideas. The Greek language became the lingua franca of the known world. From Egypt to Bactria, cities founded by Alexander became centers of learning, art, and science. The greatest of them all, Alexandria in Egypt, rose as a beacon of human knowledge. Its library, said to contain hundreds of thousands of scrolls, drew scholars from across continents. Within its halls, philosophers debated the nature of the cosmos, mathematicians charted the stars, and physicians unlocked the secrets of the body. This new era, born from chaos, would come to be known as the Hellenistic Age, a time when Greek thought, blended with Persian, Egyptian, and Eastern traditions, reshaped the ancient world. Statues grew more lifelike, philosophy turned inward, and science reached new heights. The old city-states of Greece no longer ruled the world, but there, from the ashes of conquest rose something greater, a civilization that no longer belonged to one people, but to all. The Greeks had taught the world how to think, to question, to dream, and though their power waned, their ideas would echo through Rome, through Byzantium, and into the modern world itself. Alexander's empire had died, but his vision, and Greece's eternal flame, had just begun to burn. By the time the 2nd century before Christ dawned, the world that had once trembled before Alexander's armies now found itself overshadowed by a new power, a power not born of myth or philosophy, but of iron discipline and relentless ambition. From the west came Rome, a city built on conquest, law, and the unyielding will of its citizens. Its legions marched not for glory alone, but for destiny, and destiny had set its gaze upon Greece. Greece, by then, was no longer united. The proud city-states that once stood as symbols of freedom and rivalry now bickered among themselves, weakened by centuries of wars and foreign rule. The Macedonian kings, descendants of Alexander's generals, still held sway over the north, while the southern cities, Athens, Corinth, and Sparta, struggled to preserve fragments of their ancient identity. But beneath the marble columns and sunlit temples, the pulse of power had faded. The philosophers still taught in the agora, the theaters still echoed with tragedy and laughter, yet the world beyond their shores had grown vast and unforgiving. Rome entered not as an invader at first, but as a manipulator. Through alliances and deceit, it positioned itself as Greece's protector, intervening in disputes between rival states. The Greeks, weary of endless conflict, welcomed their help. But soon, the iron embrace of Rome tightened. The Macedonian Wars swept across the land, pitting the disciplined legions against the once mighty armies of the successors. One by one, the kingdoms fell. In 168 BCE, the Romans crushed King Perseus of Macedon at the. By 146 BCE, Greece's fate was sealed. The city of Corinth, one of the wealthiest in the ancient world, defied Rome and paid the price. The legions stormed its walls, slaughtered its people, and burned the city to ash. The message was clear: the age of the Greek states had ended. Greece became a province under Roman rule, its destiny no longer its own. And yet, paradoxically, as Greece fell, its spirit conquered its conquerors. The Romans, though masters of the world, were enthralled by the civilization they had subdued. They adopted Greek gods under Latin names, studied Greek philosophy, and filled their cities with Greek art. Roman senators quoted Socrates, generals read Homer, and emperors sought to match the ideals of Alexander. The conquerors became the disciples. Rome, in its grandeur, became the new vessel of Hellenic culture. In Athens, once the heart of the Greek world, the academy continued to teach, now attended by young Romans eager to learn the wisdom of the ancients. The words of Plato and Aristotle flowed into Latin, shaping the minds of a new generation of rulers. Even as Greek temples crumbled, their marble forms inspired Roman architecture, a living memory carved into every column and arch. To the Greeks who lived under Roman rule, there was sorrow, but also pride. Though their cities no longer commanded armies, their culture commanded the soul of the empire. Greece had lost its independence, but gained immortality. Its stories, its science, its philosophy, all were carried across the Mediterranean by Roman ships, to lands that had never known the olive or the lyre. By the time the Roman Empire reached its height, to be educated meant to be Greek in spirit. And in that, the Greeks had achieved a victory greater than any won by spear or sword. Their world had ended, but their ideas had become the world. Though Greece's political independence had faded beneath the Roman eagle, its spirit began a second life, one not bound by borders, but carried in the minds and hearts of humanity. The empire that conquered Greece found itself conquered in turn, not by spears or ships, but by the sheer brilliance of Greek thought. The Romans built roads, aqueducts, and legions, yet they looked to Greece for guidance on what it meant to live, to reason, to rule, and to dream. From this unlikely union, Roman power and Greek intellect, emerged the foundation of Western civilization itself. Greek philosophy became Rome's moral compass. Stoicism, born from the teachings of Zeno of Citium, found a new champion in Roman thinkers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, who wrote in Latin yet thought like Greeks. The words of Aristotle, Plato, and Epicurus were copied, translated, and debated in the libraries of Rome and later Byzantium. The pursuit of knowledge, reason, and virtue, all Greek in origin, became the pillars upon which empires built their laws and societies. Even in art and architecture, the Greek influence endured. Roman temples mirrored the perfection of Greek columns. Their sculptures, though crafted by Roman hands, sought the same harmony, balance, and proportion that once defined Athens and Delphi. To be civilized in Rome meant to emulate the Greeks, to speak their language, study their poets, and revere their gods. In this, the Greeks achieved something few civilizations ever could. They transcended conquest itself. When the Roman Empire divided and the Byzantine Empire rose in its eastern shadow, Greece became its intellectual and spiritual heart. The city of Constantinople, founded by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, stood as a beacon of Greek culture reborn, its scholars preserving the manuscripts, philosophies, and histories that might otherwise have been lost to time. The Byzantines spoke Greek, worshipped in Greek, and passed down a legacy that reached far beyond their empire's golden walls. Then, as centuries passed and Europe entered its darkened age, the light of Greece flickered but never went out. Monks in distant monasteries carefully copied Greek texts, line by candlelight. The wisdom of Plato and Aristotle slumbered in ink until it was reawakened during the Renaissance, when the scholars of Italy rediscovered the forgotten treasures of the ancient world. It was as if Greece itself had been reborn, not as a nation, but as a memory that refused to die. From Florence to London, from Paris to Berlin, Greek ideals of reason, beauty, and democracy reshaped the modern mind. The architects of the Enlightenment looked to Athens for their model of rational inquiry and civic freedom. Scientists, philosophers, and artists across centuries, Galileo, Newton, Voltaire, Jefferson, all traced their lineage to those first thinkers who gathered beneath the olive trees of Attica. Even today, echoes of Greece lie hidden in the world around us. Every parliament, every university, every marble courthouse, and every debate on freedom carries within it the DNA of that ancient land. The Olympic flame still burns, rekindled every 4 years in the soil of Olympia. The names of Greek gods still drift through our language, in medicine, astronomy, literature, and beyond. And though the Parthenon stands weathered and broken, its ruins remind us that beauty, once born, never truly fades. Greece may have fallen to Rome, and Rome may have crumbled to time, but the Greek spirit, like the eternal sea that surrounds its islands, endures. It whispers in the winds of the Aegean, in the verses of Homer, and in the dreams of every civilization that dared to wonder what it means to be human. Long before philosophers debated beneath marble colonnades, before generals carved their empires into stone, Greece was a land of whispers and wonder, where mountains breathed, rivers sang, and every shadow could hold a god. To the ancient Greeks, the world was alive, filled with spirits and deities that mirrored the passions, flaws, and glories of humankind. Their myths were not merely stories. They were reflections of existence itself, love and vengeance, creation and chaos, birth and death entwined in endless dance. High above the mortal world stood Mount Olympus, wreathed in clouds and eternal light. It was said to be the home of the gods, a realm where immortal laughter echoed across the heavens. At its summit sat Zeus, the thunder-wielding king of gods and men. His gaze commanded the storms, and his will decided the fates of mortals. By his side was Hera, proud and regal, protector of marriage yet haunted by jealousy and divine rage. Each god upon Olympus carried their own domain. Poseidon, lord of the seas, whose trident could stir earthquakes beneath the waves. Athena, born from Zeus's mind, goddess of wisdom and war's noble art. Apollo, radiant god of light, music, and prophecy. And Artemis, the untamed huntress of moonlit forests. To the Greeks, these deities were not distant cosmic forces, but beings who lived, loved, and erred like humans. They quarreled, fell in love, deceived, and punished. Through them, the Greeks explored every corner of human nature, the beauty of courage, the folly of pride, the sorrow of loss. When the rain fell, it was Zeus's mercy. When the sea raged, Poseidon's wrath. When a poet felt inspired, it was the touch of Apollo's lyre. Life itself was divine theater, every dawn a gift from the gods. Among their tales, the myths of heroes held a special place. Mortals who defied fate and brushed against the realm of the divine. Heracles, whose strength defied imagination, suffered 12 impossible labors to atone for his. Yet, not all stories were of victory. Many spoke of tragedy, of heroes undone by their own pride, or hubris, as the Greeks called it. Icarus soared too close to the sun on wings of wax, his ambition melting into the sea below. Narcissus, entranced by his own reflection, wasted away beside the water's edge. Even mighty kings like Oedipus and Agamemnon fell not by enemies' swords, but by the weight of destiny and their own choices. To the Greeks, tragedy was not cruelty, it was truth. The gods gave men freedom, but not escape from fate. Their temples, rising in marble and sunlight, were built as bridges between earth and heaven. In Delphi, the oracle spoke in riddles, her voice said to carry the breath of Apollo himself. In Athens, the Parthenon gleamed with offerings to Athena, its columns reaching toward the divine. Across every city-state, from Corinth to Sparta, festivals honored the gods with dance, sacrifice, and song, acts of devotion that bound the mortal and immortal worlds together. But behind the grandeur lay something deeper, an understanding that gods were reflections of humanity itself. The Greeks did not worship perfection, they worshipped complexity. Their deities were flawed, passionate, and alive, as were they. Through myth, they gave meaning to chaos, beauty to suffering, and hope to mortality. In those tales, the Greeks found comfort, for even in the face of death, they believed that to live fully, to feel deeply, was to partake in something divine. As night fell over the ancient land, the fires in the temples flickered like stars brought to earth. The voices of priests and poets echoed through time, carrying tales of gods and men, tales that would never fade. And as you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you can still hear them, the whispers of Olympus, the rustle of olive trees, and the eternal song of a people who turned the mystery of existence into poetry that never dies. As dawn broke over the Aegean, a soft golden light washed across the white stones of Athens, illuminating a city unlike any the world had ever seen. Perched proudly upon its rocky hill, the Acropolis stood as both sanctuary and symbol, a gleaming crown of marble temples reaching toward the heavens. Below, the city stirred to life, merchants opening their stalls in the agora, artisans hammering bronze in narrow alleys, philosophers gathering beneath the shade of olive trees to debate the mysteries of existence. Athens was alive, a heartbeat of thought, art, and ambition that would echo through the centuries. But the Athens that came to define the ancient world was not born in peace. Its journey was forged in conflict and transformation. In the early days, Athens was ruled by kings and later by aristocrats, their power upheld by bloodlines and wealth. Yet beneath them, the common people, farmers, craftsmen, and soldiers, began to demand a voice. Tensions brewed until the city stood on the edge of civil unrest. Then came Solon, a wise lawgiver who sought to bring order through balance. He abolished debt slavery, reformed the courts, and opened the door to participation in government. His laws did not create equality, but they planted the seed of something new, the idea that citizens, not kings, could rule themselves. That seed would blossom under Cleisthenes, who reorganized Athens into tribes that broke old loyalties and bound people together by geography rather than birth. From this, democracy, rule of the people, took shape. In the assembly, ordinary men could raise their voices, debate policy, and vote on matters that shaped their world. It was a radical idea, fragile and imperfect, but revolutionary nonetheless. The notion that freedom was not granted by gods or kings, but claimed by citizens, would change the course of human history. As Athens grew in power, so too did its culture. The city became a magnet for thinkers, poets, and artists. The philosopher Socrates walked barefoot through the markets, questioning everything: gods, justice, truth, reducing even the proudest citizens to silence through his relentless logic. His student, Plato, envisioned a world of ideals, where truth and virtue transcended the illusions of daily life. And Aristotle, Plato's pupil, would go on to map the very structure of knowledge itself, from ethics to biology. Their thoughts, born beneath Athenian skies, still guide human reason thousands of years later. Art and architecture flourished alongside philosophy. Sculptors carved gods and heroes in marble so lifelike they seemed ready to breathe. The Parthenon rose as a hymn to Athena, goddess of wisdom and protector of the city, its proportions so perfect they seemed to defy mortal craftsmanship. In the theaters carved into hillsides, playwrights like Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus transformed myth into drama, exploring the human soul in its most fragile moments. Through laughter and tragedy, they taught lessons about fate, pride, and compassion that still resonate in our modern hearts. Athens was also a naval power, its triremes slicing through the Aegean like silver blades. The Persian Wars had tested the city's mettle. When the mighty Persian Empire sought to crush the free states of Greece, Athens stood firm. At Marathon, its soldiers fought not for a king, but for their homeland and their freedom. And at Salamis, its ships turned the tide of history, defeating a fleet many times their size. From that victory rose a new confidence and a new ambition. Athens began to see itself not merely as a city, but as a beacon for all of Greece. Yet with power came pride. Wealth flowed from its empire of allied city-states, who paid tribute to their Athenian overlords. The marble shone brighter, the festivals grew grander, and the philosophers more daring. But beneath the brilliance, rivalries simmered, for not all Greeks welcomed Athens' dominance. Across the mountains and plains, Sparta watched with wary eyes, its warriors sharpening their spears in silence. For now, though Athens basked in its golden age, a rare moment in history when art, intellect, and freedom flourished side by side. Beneath the Mediterranean sun, a civilization had discovered not only how to live, but how to think, how to dream, and how to leave behind something eternal. The echoes of those voices, of thinkers, artists, and common men, still linger in the air, whispering through time. The birth of wisdom, the dawn of democracy, the song of Athens. While Athens dreamed in marble and philosophy, far to the south on the broad plains of Laconia, another city awoke, not to the sound of poets or orators, but to the clang of bronze and the march of warriors. Sparta was unlike any place in the ancient world. Where Athens celebrated freedom and debate, Sparta demanded silence, obedience, and strength. It was a society built not upon art or commerce, but upon discipline and endurance, a city forged from iron, where every citizen was a soldier and every life a lesson in sacrifice. Sparta's story began with conquest. The Spartans, descendants of the Dorians, had seized the fertile lands of the Peloponnese, subjugating their neighbors, the Helots, enslaved farmers who worked the fields to feed the Spartan state. To keep this vast population in check, Sparta became a fortress, its people molded into warriors from birth. Every Spartan child was born into the service of the city. When an infant entered the world, elders inspected it. If deemed weak or unfit, it was cast aside, left to the wilderness. Those who survived began training at the age of 7 in the agoge, a brutal education of hunger, hardship, and endurance designed to purge fear and forge loyalty. In the agoge, boys learned not to question orders, but to endure them. They marched barefoot through winter, slept beneath the open sky, and learned to steal food, not for mischief, but for survival. They were taught few words, for in Sparta, silence was a virtue and speech was power. At 20, those who endured became soldiers, members of the most feared military in Greece, the Spartan hoplites, who fought in perfect unity, shields interlocked in the deadly phalanx formation. At the heart of this world was discipline, for Sparta believed that strength lay not in individuals, but in the collective. The state came before the self, and freedom meant mastery over weakness. Spartan men lived in barracks until 30, dining together, training together, and dying together. Marriage was a duty to the city, not to love. Even women, though they did not fight, were expected to embody Spartan ideals, strong, confident, and unflinching. They trained in athletics, managed estates, and raised sons who were told from birth, "Come back with your shield," or "on it." Though often seen as harsh, Sparta's system had a strange beauty, a purity of purpose that other cities could neither understand nor match. Its simplicity bred resilience. Its austerity forged unity. To the outside world, Spartans seemed emotionless, yet within their walls, they believed they were the chosen guardians of Greece's true virtue, strength, honor, and order. This belief was tested during the Persian Wars, when an army of thousands marched west under King Xerxes, determined to crush Greece once and for all. At the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae, the Spartans stood as the last defense of freedom. King Leonidas led 300 warriors against the might of Persia's countless soldiers. For 3 days, they held the line, their bronze armor glinting in the sun, their discipline unbroken. Though they were slain to the last man, their sacrifice became immortal, a symbol of defiance against tyranny. "Go tell the Spartans," their epitaph read, "that we lie here obedient to their laws." In that moment, Sparta transcended fear and became legend. Their discipline had turned flesh into steel, and their courage ignited all of Greece to rise and fight. The victory that followed at Plataea and Salamis would owe much to the spirit of those who stood at Thermopylae, proof that the strength of a people's will could defy even the vastest empire. Yet, victory carried irony. In triumph, Sparta's purpose began to shift. As Athens grew rich and proud in its golden age, Sparta grew wary, mistrusting the intellectual decadence it saw spreading across Greece. The two great powers, one of the mind, one of the sword, were destined to clash. But for now, the fires of Sparta burned steady, a flame of discipline in a world of change. And so, as you drift deeper into the story, imagine the soft thud of sandals on sand, the gleam of spears catching dawn's first light, and the silence of men who speak not in words, but in loyalty. Sparta was not a city of comfort. It was a temple to strength. Its people lived few words, but left behind one eternal truth. Freedom is not given. It is earned through sacrifice. For a time, Greece stood united, bound by the memory of Persian defeat and the glory of freedom. But beneath the shining marble of Athens and the silent steel of Sparta, envy and fear began to smolder. The peace that followed victory was fragile, for two visions of the world could not coexist forever. Athens, proud and eloquent, ruled the seas with its mighty fleet and its empire of allies. Allies who were no longer free, but subjects bound by tribute and fear. Sparta, austere and watchful, ruled the land with its disciplined warriors, mistrusting the ambition and arrogance that glimmered across the Aegean. It was only a matter of time before their rivalry would consume them both. The spark came quietly, as it often does in history, a quarrel between smaller states, a test of alliances. But once ignited, it became a fire that devoured an age. In 431 BCE, Athens and Sparta declared war, a war not for survival, but for dominance, for pride, for the right to define what Greece itself should be. It would rage for nearly 3 decades, a long and bitter struggle that turned brothers into enemies and turned the brilliance of Greece into ash. At the beginning, Athens seemed invincible. Behind the long walls that connected the city to its port at Piraeus, it could withstand siege and supply itself through the sea. Its leader, Pericles, the great orator and statesman, urged patience and strategy over rash battle. Under his guidance, Athens became both fortress and beacon, an island of democracy surrounded by a sea of enemies. But fate, indifferent to wisdom, struck first not with spears, but with sickness. A terrible plague swept through the crowded city, carried by ships from distant lands. It killed tens of thousands, citizens, soldiers, and slaves alike, sparing neither rich nor poor. Even Pericles himself fell to the disease, leaving Athens without its guiding voice. Sparta, meanwhile, struck the countryside, burning crops and villages, while its allies pressed from all sides. Yet the Athenians refused to yield. The war dragged on, years blending into years, victories followed by defeats, peace treaties made and broken. The Athenian navy brought destruction to Peloponnesian shores. Spartan armies laid waste to Attica. Both sides believed the gods were with them, and both learned that the gods, if they watched, did so silently. In the midst of the chaos rose new figures. men of cunning, ambition, and ruthlessness. Among them was Alcibiades, a brilliant but reckless Athenian general whose charm matched his betrayal. One moment, he urged Athens toward conquest in Sicily. The next, he fled to Sparta, offering his former enemies the secrets of his homeland. His shifting loyalties mirrored the spirit of the age, restless, prideful, and doomed. The Sicilian expedition would prove Athens' greatest folly. Lured by dreams of empire, its fleet sailed across the sea to conquer Syracuse. But what awaited them was disaster, a trap of unfamiliar land, relentless enemies, and divine irony. The Athenian army was crushed, its ships burned, its survivors dragged away in chains. Back home, despair spread through the streets like the plague once had. The empire was crumbling, and the dream of Athenian supremacy began to fade. Sparta, guided by endurance and aided by Persian gold, built a fleet of its own and struck back at sea, turning Athens' greatest strength into its ruin. One by one, its allies deserted. The final blow came in 404 BCE, when the Spartan admiral Lysander blockaded Piraeus and cut off Athens from its lifeline. Starvation and surrender followed. The once great city, whose voice had taught the world the meaning of freedom, was silenced. When the war ended, Greece itself was broken. Sparta stood victorious, but hollow. Athens lay in ruins, its democracy in chains. The Golden Age had ended not with a grand triumph, but with exhaustion, betrayal, and loss. In seeking to rule Greece, both cities had destroyed the unity that once saved them. The poets would later say that hubris, the pride that defies the gods, had undone them. And perhaps it had. As night settles over the ashes of their war, imagine the quiet that followed. Ships rotting in empty harbors, temples standing against a sky gone cold. The voices of philosophers, soldiers, and lovers all silenced by the same wind that once carried their dreams. History, for all its brilliance, is never gentle. And Greece, that land of light, had learned that even the brightest fire must one day burn itself out. In the years that followed the Peloponnesian War, Greece was a wounded land. Its cities lay weakened, its people divided, and its glory dimmed. The proud voices of Athens and Sparta had grown hoarse with grief and rivalry, while smaller states squabbled over what remained of the old order. Trade faltered, alliances fractured, and faith in the gods began to fade beneath the weight of endless disappointment. The Golden Age of Greece had given the world beauty, wisdom, and art, but it had not given it peace. And into that silence, from the rugged northern lands beyond Olympus, came a new power, Macedon. To the southern Greeks, the Macedonians had long been regarded as half-barbaric, mountain people, rough and warlike, who spoke a dialect of Greek but lacked its refinement. Yet it was from this rough soil that destiny would grow. King Philip II of Macedon, born in 382 BCE, was a man of cunning and vision. He had seen the failings of the Greek city-states, and he understood that only unity, by persuasion or by force, could restore strength to a land torn apart by pride. When he came to power, Macedon was beset by enemies and instability, but Philip possessed something few rulers did: patience. He reformed the army, training his soldiers in a new kind of warfare, built around discipline, strategy, and an unbreakable formation, the Macedonian phalanx. Each soldier, armed with a sarissa, a pike twice the length of the old Greek spear, became a part of a living wall, an unstoppable tide of iron and will. Behind them stood cavalry, led by the king himself, ready to strike with precision and fury. In a few short years, Philip turned a divided kingdom into the most efficient war machine the Greek world had ever seen. But Philip was not only a warrior, he was a statesman. Through diplomacy and marriage alliances, he bound neighboring tribes and cities to his rule. Through gold from his northern mines, he bought loyalty where he could not win it by sword. One by one. Yet even as Philip celebrated his victories, a greater force stirred beside him, his son, Alexander. From his earliest days, Alexander had shown signs of a restless and extraordinary spirit. Tutored by Aristotle, the philosopher who taught him logic, ethics, and wonder, the young prince learned to see the world as both battlefield and mystery. He tamed the wild horse Bucephalus when no other man could, not through strength, but understanding. And though he loved his father, he dreamed of surpassing him. Philip's ambitions did not end with Greece. He planned to cross the Aegean and wage war against Persia, to avenge the old invasions and carry Greek power to the very heart of Asia. But before he could begin his campaign, fate intervened. In 336 BCE, during a celebration in Aegae, Philip was struck down by an assassin's blade, his life ending in a moment of chaos and conspiracy. Some whispered that the plot had been born within his own family, that the shadow of ambition had reached too close to home. When the dust settled, Alexander, just 20 years old, inherited the throne. Many thought the young king too inexperienced, too impetuous, to hold the empire his father had built. But they underestimated him. Within months, he crushed rebellions, secured his borders, and restored fear and awe to the name of Macedon. The student of Aristotle had become the master of men. Standing before the assembled armies of Greece, Alexander took up his father's unfinished dream, to march eastward, to conquer Persia, and to unite the world under a single banner. The torch of Greece, long dimmed by civil war, burned bright once more, but now it was held in the hand of a man whose destiny reached beyond Greece, beyond Europe, beyond imagination itself. And so, from the ashes of Athens and the silence of Sparta, rose a new era, one born not of democracy or philosophy, but of empire. The gods, it seemed, were not yet done with Greece. For in the heart of Alexander, the world would be remade. When Alexander ascended to the throne of Macedon, the world trembled with uncertainty and awe. He was only 20, yet he possessed the bearing of one who believed himself chosen by destiny. His gaze was sharp, his voice calm, and his confidence unshakable. He carried within him the fire of youth and the wisdom of his teacher, Aristotle, whose lessons in philosophy, science, and politics had shaped his mind as surely as war would shape his soul. But unlike the thinkers of Athens, Alexander was not content to ponder the world. He sought to conquer it. His first act as king was not to rest upon his father's legacy, but to prove himself worthy of it. Rebellions broke out across Greece, as city-states saw an opportunity to throw off Macedonian rule. But Alexander's response was swift and merciless. He marched south, his armies moving like a living storm. At Thebes, when the citizens dared to defy him, he unleashed such fury that the city was razed to the ground, its people slaughtered or enslaved. Only the house of the poet Pindar was spared, a gesture of reverence from one who respected the glory of art even amid ruin. The message was clear: Macedon's rule would not be challenged. The age of doubt was over. With Greece subdued, Alexander turned his gaze eastward, toward Persia, the vast empire that had once threatened Greece itself. The dream that had begun with his father now burned fully within him, to avenge the ancient invasions of Xerxes and Darius, and to bring the East under Greek dominion. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait dividing Europe and Asia, and as his feet touched the sands of Asia Minor, he cast a spear into the ground before him, proclaiming it a gift to the gods and a claim to the world. The campaign that followed would become one of the greatest military feats in history. At the Battle of the Granicus, Alexander's army met the Persians for the first time. Against overwhelming odds, he led a direct cavalry charge across the river, his golden helmet gleaming like fire under the sun. Though struck on his helmet and nearly slain, he fought his way through with unstoppable ferocity. The Persians broke, and Asia Minor fell under his command. Everywhere he went, Alexander combined conquest with vision. Cities surrendered not only to his sword but to his charisma, for he was more than a warrior. He was a builder of empires. He founded new cities, each bearing his name, Alexandria, that would become centers of Greek culture and learning for centuries to come. In Egypt, he was hailed not as conqueror, but as liberator, freeing the people from Persian rule. At the oracle of Siwa, the priests declared him the son of Zeus Ammon, a god among men. Whether he believed it or merely used it, Alexander began to act with the confidence of one touched by divinity. But his greatest challenge awaited him on the plains of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, where Darius III, king of Persia, gathered an army said to outnumber Alexander's 10-1. The battle was chaos and glory intertwined. Dust rose like thunderclouds, chariots screamed across the field, and yet through the smoke, Alexander's strategy prevailed. His forces broke through the Persian center, and Darius fled, his empire crumbling behind him. The Achaemenid Empire, that vast and ancient power, was undone in a single day. Now ruler of half the known world, Alexander pressed on. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, all fell before him. In Persepolis, the grand palace of the Persian kings, Alexander gazed upon the treasures of centuries, then, in a night of fire and wine, allowed the city to burn. Some said it was revenge for Xerxes' destruction of Athens. Others whispered it was madness. Yet Alexander's hunger was not for wealth or vengeance, but for eternity. He marched ever eastward, through deserts, across mountains, into the unknown. His soldiers began to weary, longing for home, but their king was insatiable. There are no more worlds to conquer, he once said with sorrow, as if conquest itself were not enough. In India, he met elephants, monsoons, and warriors as fierce as his own, but still he pressed forward until his men, exhausted and homesick, refused to go farther. At last, Alexander turned back, not defeated, but human. He returned to Babylon, where his empire stretched from Greece to Egypt, from Persia to the edge of India, a realm larger than any before. But even gods must fall. In 323 BCE, at only 32 years old, Alexander fell ill, perhaps from fever, poison, or exhaustion, and died without an heir. As he lay dying, his generals asked him to whom he left his empire. His whispered answer became legend: to the strongest. And with that, the man who had sought to unite the world left it divided once more. His name forever etched in the heart of history, a symbol of boundless ambition and fleeting glory. When Alexander the Great breathed his last in Babylon, a silence fell over the empire like the stillness before a storm. His generals stood around his deathbed, men who had followed him through deserts and mountains, who had seen gods and empires crumble before him. But now their king was gone, and with him, the dream of unity began to fracture. The body of Alexander had not yet cooled before his empire began to tear itself apart. No heir had been named clearly. His wife, Roxana, was with child, but no one knew if it would be a son. His half-brother, Aridaeus, was weak-minded, unfit to rule. And so, among the marble halls of Babylon, the generals, men known as the Didakai, meaning successors, turned their eyes not to loyalty, but to power. Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander, names that would soon echo across battlefields and centuries. At first, they tried to hold the empire together. They divided the provinces, each taking a share under the guise of protecting Alexander's legacy. Perdiccas acted as regent, while Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus claimed Babylon, Antigonus governed Asia Minor, and others scattered across Greece and Macedonia. But ambition is a fire that consumes reason. Each man believed himself the rightful heir to Alexander's throne. Each saw not a regency, but a crown waiting to be claimed. Perdiccas, grasping for control, marched to assert his authority, but he made the fatal mistake of challenging Ptolemy in Egypt. The Nile swallowed his army, and his men turned on him, ending his life in betrayal. Ptolemy, the cunning strategist, secured not only Egypt, but also something far more precious: Alexander's body. As the funeral procession carried the embalmed remains toward Macedonia, Ptolemy intercepted it, bringing the great conqueror to rest in Alexandria, his new city on the Nile. There, beneath golden domes and eternal sun, Alexander would sleep forever, his tomb a symbol of Egypt's new dynasty. As the wars continued, blood soaked the lands from Greece to Persia. Brothers turned on brothers, allies became enemies, and cities burned in the name of long-dead glory. Antigonus the One-Eyed sought to claim the entire empire, proclaiming himself king. But the others joined forces against him. In 301 BCE, at the Battle of Ipsus, the earth trembled beneath tens of thousands of soldiers and war elephants. The clash was thunderous and final. Antigonus was slain, and with him, the last hope of a reunited empire. In the aftermath, three great kingdoms emerged from the ashes of Alexander's dream. Ptolemy ruled Egypt, founding a line of pharaohs that would last for centuries, culminating in the famous Cleopatra. Seleucus carved out the vast Seleucid Empire, stretching from Syria to the borders of India. Antigonus' descendants, the Antigonids, held Macedonia and Greece. The once unified realm was now a constellation of powers, Greek in culture, but divided in ambition. Yet even amid this chaos, something remarkable endured. Though Alexander's empire was gone, his vision of a connected world remained alive. Greek became the language of kings and merchants from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush. Cities bearing his name thrived as centers of art, science, and philosophy. The age that followed would be known as the Hellenistic era, a time when East and West blended into something new, a crossroads of ideas and cultures unlike anything the world had seen before. In Egypt, under the shadow of the great lighthouse of Pharos, the library of Alexandria rose, an empire of the mind that sought to gather all knowledge of the world. In distant lands, Greek art met Persian grace, and the gods of Olympus shared temples with foreign deities. Trade flowed like blood through the veins of the new kingdoms, carrying silk, spices, and stories from one end of the world to the other. But behind this cultural brilliance lay the quiet sorrow of what had been lost. The empire that could have united the world was gone, undone not by enemies, but by the hands of those who once swore loyalty to its creator. Still, in the whisper of ancient scrolls and the marble faces of statues, Alexander's spirit lived on, a reminder that even the greatest dreams can crumble, yet still shape the future in their ruins. The wars of the Diadochi were over, but the Hellenistic world had just begun, a civilization born from the ashes of conquest, where the light of Greece would burn brightly one last time before fading into the long night of Rome. From the ruins of Alexander's empire rose something astonishing, not another single kingdom, but a world reborn in his image. The lands from Greece to India began to hum with a shared rhythm, a mingling of cultures, ideas, and faiths that turned the old boundaries of the world into open doors. This was the Hellenistic age, when the flame of Greek civilization spread farther than ever before, carried not by conquest now, but by art, science, and philosophy. The three great successor kingdoms, the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, and the Antigonid Kingdom in Macedonia, each became a vessel for this new hybrid culture. Their rulers wore Greek crowns, spoke Greek tongues, and worshipped Greek gods, yet the lands they governed were mosaics of peoples: Egyptians, Persians, Jews, Syrians, Babylonians, and countless others. In this blending, something entirely new was born. The Hellenistic world was not purely Greek, nor purely Eastern, but a breathtaking fusion of both, a civilization where East met West, and the exchange of knowledge became the new conquest. Nowhere was this fusion more vivid than in Alexandria, the shining jewel of the Mediterranean. Founded by Alexander but perfected by the Ptolemies, it became the beating heart of the New World. Along its grand boulevards, philosophers, poets, mathematicians, and travelers from every corner of the earth mingled beneath the shadow of the great lighthouse of Pharos, one of the seven wonders. At its center stood the legendary Library of Alexandria, a sanctuary of learning said to hold 500,000 scrolls, the accumulated wisdom of every civilization known. Here, scholars sought to understand the universe itself, Men like Euclid laid the foundations of geometry, Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the earth with astonishing precision, and Archimedes, the genius from Syracuse, dreamed up machines that defied imagination. The stars were mapped, the human body studied, and the mysteries of nature questioned as never before. This was not the Greece of philosophers debating beneath the olive trees. This was Greece magnified, its curiosity unleashed upon the vastness of the known world. In the eastern realms of the Seleucid Empire, Greek soldiers married Persian women, blending traditions, languages, and gods. Cities such as Antioch, Pergamon, and Seleucia became centers of trade and art, filled with marble temples and bustling markets, where spices from India met silver from Macedonia. In distant Bactria, Greek kings ruled lands once part of Persia, their coins bearing the faces of Zeus beside local deities. Even in India, the Greek influence echoed. The sculptures of Buddha began to take on the serene, idealized forms inspired by Greek art. This era was one of dazzling sophistication, but also of quiet decline. Beneath the beauty and brilliance, the successors of Alexander struggled to maintain balance. Their kingdoms were vast but fragile, their loyalty bought with gold and trade. In Egypt, the later Ptolemies grew decadent, their courts filled with intrigue and whispers. In the East, the Seleucid Empire stretched too thin, crumbling under its own weight as new powers, the Parthians and Romans, began to rise like shadows on the horizon. And yet, even as these kingdoms weakened, the cultural flame they had ignited could not be extinguished. Greek thought had become the language of reason, its art the measure of beauty, its philosophy the foundation of learning. Wherever Greek culture reached, it adapted, reshaped by local traditions, but never lost. The Hellenistic world became not a kingdom, but a state of mind, one that celebrated curiosity, exploration, and the boundless potential of the human spirit. When Rome eventually came, ironclad and relentless, it did not destroy the Hellenistic legacy. It absorbed it. Greek teachers tutored Roman sons. Greek sculptors carved Roman gods. Greek philosophers guided Roman emperors. The torch of Greece was passed on once more, lighting a new empire that would, in time, rule the same lands Alexander had once crossed. The Hellenistic age may have faded, its kingdoms turned to dust, but its essence endured. In every city that valued knowledge, in every thinker who asked why, in every artist who sought perfection, the spirit of Greece still breathed. It was as if the ancient dream of Alexander, to unite the world, had finally come true, not through conquest, but through the quiet triumph of the human mind. The world had changed. The proud city-states that once defined Greece, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, were now shadows of their former selves. The brilliance of the classical age had dimmed into memory, replaced by monarchs and dynasties ruling from distant palaces. The spirit of the polis, that sacred bond between citizen and city, between freedom and duty, began to fade like the last glow of sunset over the Aegean. And as the Greeks looked inward, across the sea another power was stirring, a power that would soon sweep across the world and write the final chapter of Greece's ancient story, Rome. At first, the Romans came as students. They admired Greek art, read Greek poetry, and learned Greek philosophy. The sons of senators studied the words of Plato and Aristotle, while sculptors in Rome copied the serene perfection of Greek statues. To the Romans, Greece was not an enemy, but a teacher, a land of wisdom and refinement that offered a vision of what civilization could be. But admiration, as history often shows, can turn swiftly into ambition. While the Hellenistic kingdoms quarreled among themselves, Rome grew in strength, discipline, and purpose. Its legions marched with machine-like precision. Its generals spoke not of dreams, but of destiny. In the 2nd century BCE, as the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires weakened, Greece's independence became a tempting prize. The Romans first intervened as allies, drawn by requests for help against Macedonian kings who sought to dominate the Greek mainland. Yet behind their polished diplomacy was a sharper intent, control disguised as protection. The Macedonian Wars brought the first true clash between Greece and Rome. At Cynocephaly in 197 BCE, the disciplined Roman legions met the mighty Macedonian phalanx, the same formation that had once conquered the known world under Alexander. The air thundered with the clash of bronze and steel, but the old tactics of Greece faltered against Rome's relentless flexibility. When the dust settled, the Macedonian army was crushed. Greece had not yet fallen, but its fate was sealed. In the years that followed, Rome played a careful game, promising freedom to the Greek cities while quietly binding them with treaties and debts. The proud ideals of the polis turned to whispers of rebellion, and when Corinth, that ancient jewel of the Peloponnese, dared to defy Rome, the response was merciless. In 146 BCE, the Roman general Lucius Mummius marched into Greece and unleashed destruction that echoed through history. Corinth was burned to the ground, its treasures looted, its people enslaved. The message was clear: the age of Greek freedom was over. Yet even in defeat, Greece conquered Rome in another way. The victors found themselves bewitched by the very culture they had subdued. Roman houses filled with Greek statues, their libraries overflowed with Greek scrolls, and their temples bore the graceful symmetry of Greek design. Poets wrote in Latin but dreamed in Greek. Philosophers like Cicero and Seneca found their moral compass in the stoicism born on Athenian streets. Even the Roman gods began to wear Greek faces. Zeus became Jupiter, Aphrodite became Venus, Ares became Mars. The Greeks, for their part, adapted as they always had. They became teachers, diplomats, and artists in the Roman world. Athens, though humbled, remained a beacon of learning. Scholars gathered in the academy and the lyceum, keeping alive the flame of philosophy. The theaters of Epidaurus and Delphi still echoed with voices reciting the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides. Though the sword had changed hands, the soul of civilization remained Greek. And so, Greece did not truly fall, it transformed. Under Roman rule, its cities flourished anew as centers of art, education, and religion. The union of Greek intellect and Roman might forged a legacy that would shape the Western world for millennia. The Greeks gave Rome its gods, its words, its ideals. Rome gave Greece immortality through empire. As night fell over the ruins of Corinth and the temples of Athens, the old gods must have looked down from Olympus and smiled. For though their temples would crumble, their myths would live on in Roman marble, in Christian scripture, and in the whisper of every age that followed. The story of Greece had ended, but the legend of Greece had just begun. Long after the last flames of Corinth faded and Roman banners fluttered over the Athenian Acropolis, the old gods of Greece did not vanish, they transformed. They withdrew from the mortal world, retreating to the golden mists of Olympus, but their presence lingered in every shadowed grove, in every echo of thunder over the Aegean, in every whisper of the wind across the ruins of forgotten temples. Though the marble shrines crumbled and the hymns fell silent, the myths endured, alive in the hearts of poets, philosophers, and dreamers who refused to forget that once the divine had walked beside men. The Greeks had always woven their world with stories. To them, the land itself was alive with sacred meaning. Every mountain, every spring, every island had its own spirit and song. Mount Olympus was not merely a peak. It was the home of Zeus, the father of gods, who ruled with thunder in his hand and wisdom in his eyes. The sea was the restless realm of Poseidon, whose moods could shape the fate of sailors and cities alike. The dawn was painted by Eos, the rosy-fingered goddess who lifted the sun from the horizon, and the night was guarded by Nyx, the mother of stars and dreams. In these myths, the Greeks found not just entertainment, but understanding. Their gods were not distant or perfect. They were reflections of humanity itself. Athena, born from the mind of Zeus, embodied wisdom and strategy, yet could be proud and unyielding. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, brought passion and jealousy in equal measure. Apollo represented reason and harmony, but his temper could be fierce, his punishments cruel. Even mighty Hera, queen of Olympus, wore her power with both grace and vengeance. In the Greek world, the divine was not pure, it was real. Generations told and retold these stories around hearths and marketplaces, in epic poems and whispered prayers. The Iliad and the Odyssey, sung by Homer's immortal voice, carried the gods into eternity. They stood beside heroes, like Achilles, who sought glory even at the cost of his life, and Odysseus, whose cunning and courage tested the patience of Poseidon himself. These tales spoke to something eternal, the struggle between fate and free will, pride and humility, love and loss. And through them, the Greeks gave the world its first great mirror, a mythology that revealed the human soul. When Rome rose, it tried to claim these myths as its own, renaming the gods, but never truly changing their essence. Yet even as the Roman Empire turned toward new faiths and the old temples fell silent, the Greek gods refused to die. Their presence survived in art, in language, in the quiet rhythm of culture. Renaissance painters centuries later would resurrect them in vivid color, philosophers would invoke their names in allegory, and poets would breathe them anew into verse. Even the Christian world, though it sought to bury the old gods beneath its churches, could not escape their echo. The image of Zeus, bearded and throned, lived on in depictions of the Almighty himself. There is something eternal in the Greek way of seeing the world, that beauty and chaos, creation and destruction, light and shadow are forever intertwined. The myths taught that no mortal could escape the will of the gods, yet every mortal could rise to greatness through courage, wisdom, or love. They taught that life was fragile but glorious, that the same spark that animates the divine also burns in human hearts. And so, even now, when you look up at the night sky and trace the constellations, Orion the hunter, Andromeda the chained, Perseus the rescuer, you are seeing the same heavens the Greeks once did, their stories etched in starlight. The gods may no longer walk among us, but their legends linger like embers that refuse to fade. The voices of Homer, Hesiod, and countless nameless storytellers still whisper across time, carrying the heartbeat of a civilization that dared to dream that mortals could touch the divine. The myths of Greece did not die because they were never merely religion. They were truth wrapped in story, the poetry of existence itself. And in every age since, mankind has returned to them, seeking again the wisdom of Olympus, the laughter of Dionysus, the courage of Heracles, and the eternal song of the Muses. For as long as stories are told and stars still burn above the sea, the gods of Greece will never truly fall silent. When the voices of the gods began to fade and the mists of myth slowly lifted from the Aegean, a new sound rose in their place, the quiet murmur of thought. The Greeks had once turned to oracles for truth, to temples for answers, to the will of Zeus to explain the thunder. But now, a few daring minds began to look inward, to ask questions not of Olympus, but of themselves. It was here, in the bustling agora of Athens, on the shaded colonnades of the academy, and in the wandering lectures of barefoot philosophers, that the greatest revolution of all began, the birth of philosophy, the awakening of human reason. In this world of marble and sunlight, men like Thales of Miletus looked upon the sea and asked what the world was made of, not as a myth, but as a mystery to be solved. He believed water was the essence of all things, a thought both simple and profound. From him came Anaximander, who imagined the universe as infinite, eternal, and governed by unseen forces. And then Pythagoras, who found divine harmony in the laws of numbers and music, believing that mathematics was the very language of the cosmos. These early seekers were called physiologoi, lovers of nature, but they were, in truth, the first scientists. Yet it was in Athens, under the blue skies of the 5th century BCE, that thought reached its golden age. The city was alive with debate, its citizens drawn to the rhythm of argument and idea. Here walked Socrates, a man who claimed to know nothing, yet revealed to others the depths of their own ignorance. He wandered through the markets, questioning soldiers, craftsmen, and politicians alike, forcing them to confront the contradictions in their beliefs. The unexamined life, he said, is not worth living. His method, relentless inquiry, guided by reason, became the foundation of Western thought. Socrates' life ended with a cup of hemlock, but his death birthed an empire of ideas. His student, Plato, took up the torch, founding the academy, the first great institution of learning in the Western world. In his dialogues, Plato imagined a realm of perfect forms, invisible and eternal, of which the material world was but a shadow. To him, truth was not found in the senses, but in the soul's memory of divine perfection. His writings, the Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedo, gave voice to questions that still haunt us. What is justice? What is beauty? What is the good life? From Plato's academy emerged his greatest pupil, Aristotle, the man who would systematize knowledge itself. Where Plato sought ideals, Aristotle sought reality. He studied the earth, the stars, the body, and the mind, organizing all that he found into a grand map of understanding. To him, every living thing had a purpose, a telos, and reason was the highest virtue. His works on logic, ethics, politics, and biology laid the foundation for centuries of science and philosophy. Even today, his fingerprints remain in the language of every discipline, from physics to poetry. But philosophy in Greece was not confined to Athens. In the East, the Stoics taught endurance and calm, believing that virtue alone was freedom. In the gardens of Epicurus, students learned that happiness was not excess, but peace, a life free from fear and pain. And in the shadow of Alexander's conquests, philosophers turned their gaze outward, pondering not the city-state but the entire world, giving birth to cosmopolitanism, the idea that all humanity shares one common soul. What began as curiosity became the very heartbeat of civilization. Greek thought was the bridge between myth and modernity, the first time man dared to ask why the universe exists, not merely how it works. It replaced the fear of divine wrath with the wonder of discovery. It taught that truth could be reasoned, that virtue could be learned, and that even the smallest human mind could grasp something eternal. And those centuries have passed, though the temples of Athena crumble and the marble of the Parthenon grows pale, the voice of Greece endures wherever thought is free. In every question we ask, in every search for truth, we echo the footsteps of those first philosophers who once stood beneath the same stars and dared to believe that reason could rival the gods. As the voices of philosophers echoed through the marble streets of Athens, another kind of spirit stirred within the Greek world, a spirit not of words, but of action. For all their love of reason and art, the Greeks were, above all, a people forged by struggle. Their homeland was a mosaic of mountains and islands, bound together not by kings or empires, but by pride, rivalry, and the ever-present need to defend their freedom. From this crucible of independence arose a generation of heroes whose courage would burn brighter than any torch on Olympus. The dawn of the 5th century BCE brought with it a shadow from the east. The Persian Empire, vast and unstoppable, stretching from the Indus to the Aegean. To the great King Darius I, the Greek city-states were but rebellious outposts at the edge of his dominion, tiny sparks that threatened to defy the empire's will. But the Greeks, especially the Athenians, cherished something the Persians could not comprehend: eleutheria, freedom. It was not a privilege, but the breath of life itself, worth any sacrifice. In the year 490 BCE, the two worlds collided upon the windswept plain of Marathon. Facing overwhelming numbers, the Athenian hoplites, farmers, craftsmen, citizens turned soldiers, stood shoulder to shoulder, bronze shields gleaming under the rising sun. They faced an empire that had conquered Babylon and Egypt, and yet they did not yield. When the order came, the Greeks charged, not cautiously, but with furious resolve, sprinting across the field as arrows darkened the sky. The shock of bronze meeting flesh, the cry of men in the dust, it was over in hours. Against all odds, the Persians were broken, their army driven into the sea. Athens had stood alone and triumphed. The victory at Marathon echoed across the Aegean like a divine omen. It was proof that courage could defy empire, that free men could resist the might of kings. Yet, even as Athens celebrated, the storm was not over. A decade later, Darius's son, Xerxes I, sought vengeance, not with one army, but with a host so vast it seemed to darken the land itself. Bridges were built across seas, mountains carved for passage, and from the east came legions of warriors and ships beyond counting. Greece trembled, but it did not bow. In the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae, the heart of resistance was forged. There stood King Leonidas of Sparta, leading just 300 Spartans and a few thousand allies against the tide of Persian might. For 3 days, they held the pass, their phalanx unbroken, their discipline absolute. Shield locked to shield, they became an iron wall, defying the empire with every thrust of their spears. When betrayal came, when the Persians found a secret path through the mountains, Leonidas knew his fate was sealed. Yet he and his men chose not to flee, but to fight to the last, holding the line so that Greece might prepare for what was to come. Their sacrifice was not in vain. From the ashes of Thermopylae rose a flame that would ignite all of Greece. At Salamis, the Athenian navy, led by Themistocles, lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits and struck with cunning precision. Wooden ships rammed and splintered, warriors fought upon decks slick with sea and blood, and by nightfall, the once mighty Persian navy was shattered. The tide of invasion broke upon the courage of free men. When, at last, the Greeks triumphed at Plataea, the empire of Xerxes withdrew, leaving behind not only its dead but a legend, one that would echo through time as the defense of civilization itself. For the Greeks, these wars were more than battles. They were proof that destiny favored those who fought for freedom, not conquest. In the silence that followed, Greece stood transformed. The city-states, once divided by rivalry, had glimpsed unity, if only for a moment. Temples were rebuilt, theaters filled with laughter again, and the gods seemed to smile upon the land that had defied the greatest power on earth. Yet beneath the triumph, new tensions brewed. For while Sparta had fought for honor, Athens had fought for glory, and glory, once tasted, is a hunger that never fades. The Persian wars had made Greece immortal, but they had also planted the seeds of its greatest tragedy. From the ashes of empire would soon rise a conflict not between East and West, but between Greeks themselves, a struggle that would shatter the harmony of the classical age and mark the beginning of its end. From the bloodied plains of Plataea rose a city reborn in brilliance. Athens, the heart of Greek pride and the beating pulse of a new world. The smoke of war had barely faded, and yet the Athenians, with hands still calloused from battle, began to build, not fortresses or weapons, but beauty. The age that followed would come to be known as the Golden Age of Athens, when the city stood not only as a fortress of freedom, but as the shining temple of human possibility. Under the guidance of Pericles, Athens became a vision of harmony and power. Marble gleamed on the Acropolis, where masons and sculptors carved stone into immortality. Upon its summit rose the Parthenon, a temple so perfectly proportioned that even the shadows seemed to fall with purpose. Inside, the statue of Athena Parthenos, draped in gold and ivory, gazed across the city that bore her name, a goddess watching over her children, her wisdom woven into every street, every column, every dream. But it was not only architecture that defined this age, it was ideas. Pericles believed that Athens should not merely be powerful, but just. He opened the doors of government to ordinary citizens, allowing every free man to speak, to vote, to shape the fate of the polis. Thus was born the first true democracy, imperfect and limited, yet unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the assembly, fishermen argued beside philosophers, farmers beside generals. The voice of the people became the heartbeat of the city, and with that pulse came both unity and chaos. For in freedom, there is noise. The agora, the marketplace, was a theater of thought, alive with the sound of debate and discovery. There, the sculptor and the thinker met as equals. Artists painted heroes in motion. Playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides wove tragedy into art, and philosophers like Anaxagoras and Socrates began to ask questions that would forever shape the nature of truth. What is virtue? What is justice? What does it mean to live well? These were not questions for kings. They were for everyone. As Athens flourished in thought, it also flourished in empire. The Delian League, once an alliance of equals against Persia, had become an Athenian empire in all but name. Tribute poured into the city, silver from the Aegean, grain from the Black Sea, and gold from conquered lands. The Athenian navy ruled the waters, its triremes swift and unstoppable, the sea itself now a road of commerce and conquest. The same city that had fought for freedom now held others in its grasp. Pericles stood at the center of this paradox, an idealist with the power of a monarch, a leader of a democracy that often bent to his will. Under his vision, Athens reached heights of beauty and intellect unmatched in history. Music, drama, and philosophy blossomed like spring after endless winter. The gods, at sea, had smiled upon the Athenians, granting them a century of light. Yet, beneath the marble and melody, the seeds of discord took root. For while Athens grew rich from the sea, her sister cities looked on with envy and resentment. None more than Sparta, the iron heart of the Peloponnesus. Where Athens was adorned in art and marble, Sparta was forged in discipline and war. Its citizens lived not for pleasure, but for endurance, not for beauty, but for strength. The two poles of Greece, mind and muscle, democracy and duty, could not coexist forever. As Athens expanded her reach, Sparta began to watch. Alliances shifted like tides, whispers of rebellion echoed through the islands, and once again, the fragile peace that had bound Greece together after Persia began to unravel. Pericles, though wise, could not stop the pull of destiny. The glory of Athens had reached its zenith, and history, ever hungry, was preparing to turn the page. Above the Parthenon, the torchlight flickered against marble walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward a darker horizon. The laughter of the theaters, the debates of the agora, the songs of poets, all would soon be drowned by the march of armies. Greece had built an empire of the mind, but empires of the mind are fragile things, easily shattered by pride and fear. For soon, Athens and Sparta, the two titans of the Greek world, would clash not as allies, but as enemies. And from that war would come both ruin and revelation. The shadow that fell over Greece began as a whisper, a murmur of distrust, a tremor beneath the marble brilliance of Athens. Sparta watched from afar, its warriors silent behind their shields, as the Athenians built their empire not only with ideas but with iron. The Delian League, once born from unity, had become Athens' chain of command. Cities that resisted were punished, their walls torn down, their people enslaved. Freedom, once sacred, had been replaced by dominion. And so, as the Golden Age reached its brightest point, the horizon darkened. In 431 BCE, the first spears of the Peloponnesian War struck the earth. Athens and her allies against Sparta and hers. A conflict not of empires, but of souls. Athens fought for ambition, for art, for the pride of intellect and empire. Sparta fought for order, for honor, for the ancient code of discipline. Two visions of Greece collided, and the land that had once stood united against Persia now devoured itself. The war began with fire. Spartan armies marched into Attica, burning fields and villages beneath the summer sun. From the walls of Athens, citizens watched their farms turn to ash while their leader, Pericles, urged patience. The Athenian navy, he said, would be their sword, swift, untouchable, striking from the sea. Behind the city walls, the people gathered, trusting their general, their democracy, their destiny. But the gods, it seemed, had other plans. In the second year of the war, an unseen enemy entered Athens, not with swords, but with fever. A plague, merciless and invisible, swept through the crowded city. The same walls that protected them from Spartan blades trapped the pestilence within. Men burned with fever, their skin darkened, their eyes hollowed. Families fell silent one by one. Corpses lined the streets, offerings to gods who did not answer. Even Pericles, the great orator of Athens, fell ill and died, leaving his city leaderless and broken. The Parthenon still gleamed above the city, but below it, Athens was crumbling from within. Yet still, the Athenians fought. They rebuilt fleets, rallied armies, and hurled themselves back into the storm. Generals like Alcibiades, brilliant and reckless, led daring campaigns across the Aegean. For every defeat, Athens answered with fire. But pride, always pride, was its undoing. The disastrous Sicilian expedition, meant to expand Athenian power, ended in ruin. Entire fleets were lost, thousands of soldiers captured or slain, and the once invincible city began to bleed out. Sparta, with aid from Persia, pressed its advantage. One by one, Athenian allies fell away, and the lifeblood of empire, the silver, the ships, the confidence, drained into the sea. The war dragged on for nearly 3 decades, an unrelenting cycle of vengeance and exhaustion. When, at last, the Spartan general Lysander surrounded Athens and cut off its supply lines, the proud city was brought to its knees. In 404 BCE, the walls that had once guarded Athens were torn down to the sound of Spartan flutes. The democracy was abolished, replaced by a brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. The empire of intellect had fallen, not to a greater power, but to its own hubris. For the Greeks, it was not merely a political collapse, but a moral reckoning. The same city that had given birth to freedom had destroyed it in pursuit of glory. And yet, even in defeat, something in Athens refused to die. The schools remained, the philosophers still gathered in the agora, and the flicker of thought, the belief that truth and beauty outlast war, endured. For from the ruins of empire would rise voices that questioned everything, the nature of justice, of virtue, of existence itself. The sword of Greece had broken, but its mind had just begun to awaken. The Peloponnesian War left scars deeper than any battlefield could reveal. Cities lay in ruins, alliances shattered, and trust dissolved into dust. But beyond the grief, Greece stood at a crossroads. Would it fall into chaos, or would it, once again, seek meaning in the ashes? The next age would not be ruled by kings or warriors, but by those who dared to ask the most dangerous question of all: why? The fires of war had faded, leaving Athens hollow and haunted. Its streets, once filled with laughter and song, now carried the faint echo of lost glory. The Parthenon still watched from the Acropolis, gleaming under the sun, but the pride that once filled the city had turned to silence. Out of this stillness, a new kind of power began to stir, not of armies or empires, but of ideas. For when walls fall and nations crumble, the mind becomes the final frontier. And so began the age of philosophers, an era not of conquest, but of questions. In the dusty corners of the agora, where merchants once shouted and crowds had cheered for generals, an old man walked barefoot through the stalls, his eyes sharp and his expression calm. His name was Socrates, a soldier once, a mason by trade, but now something far greater. To the youth of Athens, he was both maddening and magnetic. He spoke not from scrolls, but from the soul, asking questions that turned the simplest conversation into revelation. What is justice? He would ask. What is goodness? What is truth? His method was not to teach, but to unmake. He stripped away certainty until nothing was left but the raw search for wisdom itself. Socrates believed that true knowledge came not from claiming to know, but from admitting ignorance. The only thing I know, he said, is that I know nothing. In a city that once prized pride above all, his humility was revolutionary. Yet his voice did not sit easily with those who ruled. The democracy, fragile and fearful after defeat, saw in Socrates a danger, a man who questioned authority, who taught the young to think freely, who dared to hold the mirror of truth to power. And so, in 399 BCE, Athens put its wisest son on trial. The charges were impiety and corruption of the youth. But the true crime was his courage to question. Standing before the jury, Socrates refused to beg for mercy. "The unexamined life," he said, "is not worth living." He drank the hemlock calmly, his students weeping at his side, and as his heartbeat slowed, so too did an era of innocence. The body of Socrates died, but his words became immortal, whispered through time, unbound by the dust of empire. Among his students was a man who would carry that torch into eternity, Plato. Born of nobility but tempered by loss, Plato saw in his teacher's death both tragedy and awakening. He founded the Academy, the world's first true university, where minds gathered not to memorize, but to question, to reason, to imagine. In the cool courtyards beneath olive trees, Plato dreamed of a world ruled not by wealth or blood, but by wisdom. His dialogues gave life to ideas that would echo for millennia. The allegory of the cave, where humanity mistakes shadows for truth. The vision of a philosopher king, who leads not with force but with understanding. From Plato's teachings would emerge another thinker, one whose logic and precision would become the foundation of science itself, Aristotle. To him, the universe was not merely to be imagined but observed. He studied nature, ethics, politics, and the stars above, believing that knowledge was the greatest form of worship. Where Plato sought perfection, Aristotle sought pattern. Where his master reached for ideals, he reached for reality. Together, they shaped not just Greece, but the very architecture of the human mind. The philosophers of Athens became its new guardians. They defended not its walls, but its wisdom. In their questions, they preserved what the wars had nearly destroyed, the soul of civilization. Theirs was a different kind of heroism, the courage to think, to doubt, to search. The battles of Greece had once been fought with bronze and blood. Now, they were fought with thought and reason. And so, in the ruins of empire, a new empire rose, one built not of stone or soldiers, but of ideas. An empire that would stretch far beyond Greece, outlasting kings, kingdoms, and time itself. As Athens pondered the meaning of truth and virtue beneath her marble colonnades, a new power stirred to the north, a kingdom rugged and raw, forged not in the arts of philosophy, but in the crucible of survival. Macedon, a land of deep valleys and hard men, had long been dismissed by the southern Greeks as half-barbarian, a frontier where shepherds played at kingship. Yet, within its mountains, destiny was gathering strength. At its heart stood King Philip II, a man of ambition and vision, who saw what the divided city-states of Greece could not, that unity was power. Philip was no mere warrior. He was a strategist, a reformer, a master of warcraft. He reorganized the Macedonian army, arming his men with the sarissa, a pike twice the length of any spear used before. His soldiers fought as a living wall of steel, an impenetrable phalanx that moved with deadly precision. Behind them thundered his cavalry, the companions, noblemen trained to strike like lightning at his command. With diplomacy as sharp as his blade, Philip turned foes into allies, rivals into vassals. One by one, he subdued Thessaly, Thrace, and eventually Athens itself, not through destruction, but through awe. By the mid-4th century BCE, the dream of a united Greece, something philosophers had only imagined, was now a reality under Macedonian rule. But Philip's vision extended beyond the mountains and the Aegean. He spoke often of Asia, of the endless lands and wealth that lay across the narrow strait to the east. Yet before he could lead his campaign, fate intervened. In 336 BCE, at a celebration in Aegae, Philip was struck down by an assassin's blade. His body fell, but his dream did not. From his blood rose his son, Alexander. Alexander was only 20 when he took the throne, but already the world seemed to bend toward him. Tutored by Aristotle himself, he had inherited not just his father's empire, but the full breadth of Greek knowledge and ambition. From his teacher, he learned of ethics, logic, and the nature of the cosmos. From his father, he learned conquest, courage, and command. The union of those two worlds, thought and action, made him unstoppable. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with 40,000 men, stepping onto Asian soil as if stepping into myth. He visited the tomb of Achilles, his hero, and whispered that he would surpass him. What followed was not merely a campaign, it was a storm. At Granicus, Issus, and finally Gaugamela, he crushed the Persian Empire, the mightiest power the world had ever seen. His armies carved a path from the Aegean to the Indus, from Egypt's sands to Babylon's gates. Everywhere he went, he carried Greece with him, not just its soldiers, but its spirit. Cities bearing his name, Alexandria, rose from the deserts and coastlines, glittering beacons of Hellenic culture and trade. Yet Alexander's genius was not only in conquest. He saw himself as more than a king. He was a bridge between worlds. In Egypt, he bowed before the gods of the Nile. In Persia, he adopted royal customs. In India, he listened to philosophers beneath banyan trees. His vision was of a single world, a fusion of East and West, bound together by knowledge, art, and glory. But such vast ambition carried a shadow. His men, weary and homesick, began to see not a god but a man obsessed with destiny. The fire that had lifted him began to consume him. In 323 BCE, in the palace of Babylon, Alexander fell ill. Some said it was poison, others the exhaustion of a life lived at the edge of divinity. As fever overtook him, he whispered that his empire should go to the strongest. He died at 32, leaving behind not just an empire of land, but an empire of influence. His generals would tear his conquests apart in blood and betrayal, yet the world he reshaped would never be the same. The torch of Greece had been carried across continents, lighting new civilizations in its wake. In Alexander's wake came a tide of learning, art, and culture, the Hellenistic age, where the wisdom of Athens met the grandeur of the East. The sword of Macedon had conquered the body of the world, but Greek thought had conquered its soul. And though Alexander's empire would crumble, his legacy endured in every library, every monument, every dream of unity that mankind has ever dared to hold. When Alexander the Great exhaled his final breath in Babylon, the air itself seemed to tremble, as though the world paused to wonder what would become of his boundless dream. His empire, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, was too vast for one man's heirs and too fragile for peace. His generals, known as the Diadochi, carved it apart like scavengers dividing the body of a fallen god. Yet from the chaos of their rivalries, something extraordinary took shape, not an empire of swords, but an empire of ideas. The Hellenistic age had begun. It was a time when Greek language, art, and philosophy spilled across the world like sunlight after a storm. In Egypt, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's trusted companions, crowned himself pharaoh and founded a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. In Seleucid Persia, Greek and Eastern traditions fused into a cosmopolitan world of silk and stone, temples and marketplaces where gods of every pantheon shared space. To the west, in Macedon and Epirus, the old Greek heartlands watched with awe as their culture took on a life far greater than the city-states that had birthed it. But nowhere did this fusion shine brighter than in the city that bore Alexander's name, Alexandria. Rising from the Egyptian coast like a dream of marble and light, it became the beating heart of the New World. Its library, said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, was the greatest repository of knowledge ever assembled. Within its walls, scholars from Greece, Egypt, Babylon, and India gathered under a single roof to measure the heavens and map the soul. Here, Euclid laid down the foundations of geometry, while Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing precision. Herophilus dissected the human body to uncover its mysteries, and Archimedes, though based in Syracuse, became the symbol of this age's genius. A man who could move the world with a lever if only given a place to stand. Art, too, transformed. The serene perfection of classical sculpture gave way to emotion and movement. The Laocoon group, twisting in agony beneath the coils of serpents, spoke of a new realism that mirrored human struggle. Cities like Pergamon and Antioch rose with theaters, colonnades, and palaces that shimmered in the Mediterranean sun. The Greek gods, once bound to Mount Olympus, now found new homes in Egypt and Asia, where Zeus became intertwined with Ammonius, and Dionysus danced alongside Eastern deities in processions of incense and gold. Trade routes stretched farther than ever before. Greek merchants sailed the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, reaching India's spice ports and the incense lands of Arabia. Caravans wound through deserts, carrying papyrus, ivory, glass, and philosophy. The world had grown interconnected, a web of knowledge, commerce, and culture that prefigured globalization millennia before the term existed. The Greek tongue became the language of diplomacy and science. Coins bearing Alexander's profile circulated from Carthage to Kabul. Yet beneath this brilliance lay shadows. The successors of Alexander, the Ptolemies, Seleucids, and Antigonids, ruled with magnificence but also with fear. Their courts glittered with splendor, but ambition and intrigue poisoned them from within. Wars flared across the eastern Mediterranean as each dynasty sought to claim Alexander's mantle. Soldiers who once fought for glory now fought for kings who worshipped gold. Still, amid the blood and betrayal, the idea of Cosmopolis, the world as one great city of mankind, endured. For the first time in human history, philosophy and science transcended borders. Stoics taught the unity of all men under natural law. Epicureans explored the pursuit of peace and happiness in an uncertain universe. Astronomers charted stars once seen only by shepherds. Mathematicians traced invisible patterns that would later guide Newton's hand. The old gods were fading, but the search for meaning had never been stronger. In this new era, Greek identity was no longer confined to Athens or Sparta. It had become universal, a language of beauty, logic, and curiosity spoken across empires. The Hellenistic world was the echo of Alexander's dream, fractured, yet alive, scattered, yet united by the eternal quest for knowledge. And though the centuries would wash away these kingdoms, though Rome would rise and claim the world as its own, the brilliance of the Hellenistic age would never truly die. It would survive in the scrolls of philosophers, the geometry of scholars, the poetry of lovers, and the starlit curiosity of all who dared to look beyond their horizon, the inheritance of a world forever changed by Greece. As the Hellenistic kingdoms glittered beneath their jeweled crowns, a new power was stirring to the west, not yet cloaked in marble or myth, but forged in iron and discipline. Rome, the city of 7 hills, watched the splintered heirs of Alexander from across the sea with a patience that would soon become conquest. To the Greeks, it began as a whisper, tales of a republic ruled not by kings but by laws, where farmers became soldiers and senators spoke with the authority of the gods. Yet by the time they realized the scope of what Rome would become, the shadow of the eagle had already stretched across the Aegean. The old Greek heartlands had grown weary. The city-states that once thundered with the ideals of democracy and freedom were fractured by ambition and burdened by the debts of empire. Athens, now more scholar than sovereign, lived in the glory of memory, its streets echoing with the ghosts of Socrates and Pericles. Sparta, once the embodiment of discipline and strength, had become a hollow echo of its former self, its warrior spirit extinguished by centuries of decline. The once great Hellenistic monarchies, though vast and magnificent, were now bloated with intrigue. Kings more concerned with luxury than legacy, generals loyal only to gold, and cities that gleamed with marble but trembled beneath their own weight. Rome, by contrast, was hungry. Its legions moved like clockwork, guided by the pragmatic genius of its statesmen and the unyielding will of its people. When Roman ships first crossed into Greece during the wars with Macedon, many Greeks believed them to be allies, liberators even, who would defend Hellenic freedom from tyrants. But liberation soon revealed its true cost. The Romans admired Greek art, philosophy, and architecture, but they also saw opportunity in its disunity. One by one, the Macedonian kings fell. The Achaean League, once a beacon of Greek resistance, was crushed in the dust of Corinth, its treasures seized, its people enslaved. In 146 BCE, as Roman fire consumed the marble streets of Corinth, a chapter of history closed. The smoke rose over statues of gods that no longer answered, over theaters where no voice cried out, and over libraries where words of freedom and beauty turned to ash. Greece had not been conquered by barbarians, but by a civilization it had itself inspired. For every Roman soldier who burned a city, there was a Roman philosopher who quoted Plato. For every temple looted, a Roman architect who sought to rebuild in the Greek style. Rome absorbed Greece not with destruction alone, but through admiration, and in doing so, Greece became immortal. Greek slaves became teachers of Roman youth. The writings of Aristotle and Hippocrates were copied in Roman script. The gods themselves, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, found new names in Jupiter, Minerva, and Apollo, their temples raised anew beneath Latin skies. In the marble forums of Rome, senators debated using the logic of the Stoics. Generals carried Homer's Iliad as their guide to glory. The Greek spirit, far from fading, had merely found a new host. And so, while Greece lost its sovereignty, it gained eternity. The Romans ruled the world, but they did so in Greek. Every sculpture they carved, every philosophy they pondered, every tragedy they recited, was a mirror of that distant land across the sea. The language of Plato and Aristotle became the language of wisdom. The geometry of Euclid guided engineers and architects for millennia. The Olympian myths continued to whisper through centuries of empire and faith, reshaped yet eternal. Even as centuries passed and the Roman banners reached Britain and Mesopotamia, the memory of Greece lingered, not as a conquered nation, but as a state of mind. The Renaissance would later call it back from the ashes. Scholars and dreamers would resurrect its art, its science, its vision of humanity's boundless potential. Greece had fallen, yes, but only as a mountain gives way to a river, reshaping the landscape, yet feeding everything that follows. And so, as night falls over the Aegean one last time, imagine the flicker of oil lamps in the ruined colonnades, the distant sound of waves against forgotten harbors, the whisper of philosophers carried by the wind. The Greek world may have faded into Rome's embrace, but its soul endured, eternal, luminous, and alive in every idea that sought to understand the stars. Long after the marble cities of Greece crumbled and its temples fell silent, something remarkable happened. The world refused to forget. Though the banners of Rome now ruled from the Atlantic to the sands of the East, the heartbeat of Greece still pulsed beneath the empire's skin. In the quiet corners of Roman villas, Greek tutors recited Homer to their students. In the candlelit chambers of philosophers, the words of Plato still echoed like sacred hymns. The body of Greece had perished, but its spirit had become eternal, not confined by borders, but living in the mind of humankind itself. From the ruins of Athens came the philosophy that would shape empires and religions alike. Stoicism, born from Zeno's teachings beneath the painted porch of Athens, found its way into the hearts of Roman emperors. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, wrote his meditations in Greek, not Latin, whispering to himself about duty, virtue, and the fleeting nature of existence. The logic of Aristotle, the ethics of Socrates, and the metaphysics of Plato became the foundation upon which centuries of thought would be built. Even as temples turned to churches and gods gave way to a single faith, the Greek search for truth, the belief that reason could illuminate the world, endured. In science and mathematics, the Greeks had given humanity the language of the universe. Euclid drew lines that defined geometry for millennia. Archimedes, in the golden light of Syracuse, calculated the weight of the world. Hippocrates watched the human body with the calm eye of reason, laying the foundations of medicine still practiced today. Every discovery, every theorem, every whisper of logic that followed, from the scholars of Alexandria to the astronomers of the Islamic Golden Age, carried the mark of Greek thought. Art, too, bore Greece's indelible signature. Even when Roman sculptors chiseled their emperors' faces into marble, they did so with Greek precision, their hands guided by the memory of Phidias and Polykleitos. The balance, the symmetry, the quiet perfection of Greek form became the eternal ideal of beauty. When medieval Europe slumbered in darkness, fragments of Greek texts slept in monasteries, waiting for rediscovery. And when the Renaissance dawned, it was as though Greece herself awoke from a long dream. Artists like Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael looked to the statues of Athens and the writings of Aristotle for inspiration, and once again, the gods of Greece walked among men. Even in the age of faith, Greek reason endured. The early Christian philosophers, Origen, Basil, Augustine, all wrestled with Plato's ideas, weaving them into theology. In distant lands, Islamic scholars like Avicenna and Averroes preserved and expanded Greek science, their translations carrying Aristotle's logic to medieval Europe. The torch of Greece passed from hand to hand, across centuries, across empires, and yet it never dimmed. Perhaps that is Greece's greatest triumph. It conquered not through armies or wealth, but through ideas. Its citizens may have vanished, its city-states may have fallen to dust, but the world it imagined, one where the mind is free, where beauty is divine, where truth is worth suffering for, became the world we live in today. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine. The stars glimmer above the Aegean as they did thousands of years ago. Somewhere, a lone figure stands upon a cliff, the wind in his hair, the sea below him endless. He is not a soldier or a king. He is a thinker, a dreamer, a seeker. He gazes into the heavens, asking the same question that echoes through time. What is truth? What is beauty? What does it mean to be human? And in that question, whispered beneath the eternal stars, Greece still lives. Centuries passed. The voices of philosophers grew faint beneath the prayers of monks, and the marble columns of Athens stood weathered beneath the sun, relics of a forgotten age. Empires rose and fell around them. Byzantine, Ottoman, Venetian. The Parthenon became a church, then a mosque, then a ruin. Yet through every change, through every hand that claimed its stones, the idea of Greece never truly died. It waited, silent, patient, like a seed buried beneath centuries of dust, waiting for the light of rediscovery. That light came in the Renaissance, a rebirth of art, reason, and humanism that reached back across time and touched the hand of Greece once more. In Florence, in Venice, in the halls of scholars and artists, the ancient world stirred again. Forgotten manuscripts were pulled from the shadows, the dialogues of Plato, the treatises of Aristotle, the geometry of Euclid. Thinkers like Petrarch and Erasmus called Greece the teacher of mankind, and soon, her wisdom flowed through Europe like a river thawed from ice. Painters studied her statues to learn perfection. Architects copied her temples to build cathedrals. Poets wrote of her heroes, not as myths, but as ideals of what humanity could become. Then came the age of enlightenment, when reason became the new faith. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Jefferson read the works of the Greeks not as relics, but as blueprints for freedom. From Athens' democracy rose the foundation of modern republics. From Socrates' defiance came the spirit of questioning authority. The idea that a society could govern itself through reason, that truth belonged not to kings or priests but to the people, was born once in the Agora of Athens, and born again in the revolutions of the modern world. Even as Greece itself lay under Ottoman rule, its memory inspired those who had never seen its shores. Artists painted its ruins bathed in golden light. Poets dreamed of its liberty. When the Greek War of Independence, Erupted in the 19th century, the world watched with reverence. Men like Lord Byron left their homelands to fight and die for Greece's rebirth, believing that in freeing the land, they were restoring something sacred to all humanity. And when, at last, the Greek flag rose again over Athens in 1830, it was more than a nation reborn. It was a civilization remembering itself. The modern world owes more to Greece than perhaps to any other. Its philosophy shaped our thinking, its art defined beauty, its science unlocked the universe, and its politics birthed democracy. The stones of the Parthenon may be broken, but their lines still define our architecture. The plays of Sophocles and Euripides still stir hearts on stages 2,000 years later. The words freedom, reason, and truth still carry the resonance of Greek air. And yet, Greece's greatest gift is not what it built, but what it believed, that humanity has the power to rise above chaos, to seek wisdom, and to find divinity not only in the heavens, but in ourselves. So now, as the story draws to a close, picture the dawn breaking over the Aegean once more. The light spills over the ruins of temples, turning the marble gold. Fishermen cast their nets in the same waters where Odysseus once sailed. Children play in the shadow of mountains once home to gods. The past and the present blur, and for a moment, time itself bends, and you can almost hear it again. The murmur of the agora, the laughter of philosophers, the chisel of sculptors, and the eternal whisper of the wind through olive trees. This is Greece, not just a place in history, but a light that never went out. Long after the last oracle fell silent and the flames of Olympia dimmed, the gods of Greece refused to fade. They lingered, not as deities demanding worship, but as symbols, woven into the fabric of human imagination. Zeus no longer ruled the skies, but his thunder still echoed in every story of power and pride. Athena's wisdom lived on in every pursuit of knowledge. Poseidon's fury raged in every storm-tossed voyage. The Greeks had created gods in their own image, and in doing so, they had given humanity a mirror, one that still reflects who we are and who we long to be. Greek mythology was never just a religion. It was a language of truth disguised as story. The myths were maps of the human soul, describing not only the world outside but the world within. When Homer sang of Achilles, he was not merely telling of a warrior's rage. He was describing the fire that burns in every human heart when pride and fate collide. When Odysseus wandered the seas, it was not only a journey across the waves, but across the labyrinth of the human mind. These stories taught that heroism and hubris are twins, that beauty and tragedy walk hand in hand, and that even gods are bound by destiny. As centuries turned, these myths found new life in countless forms. The Renaissance sculpted their shapes in marble once again. The Enlightenment studied their morals as allegory, and in the modern age, the myths transformed into literature, film, and psychology. Sigmund Freud saw in Oedipus the eternal drama of desire and guilt. Carl Jung found in Zeus, Hera, and Hermes the archetypes of the collective unconscious, the timeless patterns of human thought. Artists painted Icarus falling, his wax wings melting against the sun, not as punishment, but as metaphor, the dreamer undone by his own daring. Even now, their shadows stretch across our stories. The hero who defies fate, the woman whose wisdom outshines men, the godlike figure brought low by arrogance. These are the same echoes that once filled the amphitheaters of Athens. The Marvel superheroes of today are but modern Olympians, battling not in temples, but in city streets. The labyrinth of the Minotaur became the maze of the mind in films and novels. Even the word Titanic carries the echo of myth, a reminder that no matter how advanced we become, the sea of the gods still humbles human ambition. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Greek mythology is not its grandeur, but its humanity. Unlike the distant gods of other ancient faiths, the Greek gods were flawed, passionate, and endlessly relatable. They loved, they lied, they burned with jealousy and joy. They were divine, yes, but also terribly, beautifully human. In them, The Greeks taught the world a quiet truth, that to be imperfect is not to be fallen, it is to be alive. The myths also taught that fate is a thread spun by unseen hands, but how we walk that thread is our choice. Like Perseus facing Medusa, or Heracles bearing his 12 labors, we too are asked to confront our monsters, not in the form of serpents or giants, but as fear, pride, grief, and doubt. The gods were not meant to be obeyed, but understood. In their triumphs and tragedies, they whispered to us, "Know yourself, for within you are both the mortal and the divine." So even now, when you look up at the night sky and trace the constellations, the hunter Orion, the winged horse Pegasus, the swan of Zeus, you are looking not only at stars, but at stories older than empires. The Greeks named the heavens so that no one would ever forget them, and in doing so, they made sure that as long as the stars exist, so too will the memory of their gods. And somewhere, perhaps in the quiet of your dreams, you can still hear them. The whisper of the muses, the laughter of Dionysus, the call of the sea where Aphrodite was born. The gods of Greece may no longer rule the world, but they will forever rule the imagination. In the cool courtyards of Athens, beneath the shade of olive trees and the hum of cicadas, the Greeks began to ask the questions that would forever define humanity. What is truth? What is virtue? What does it mean to live well? These were not questions for priests or kings, but for thinkers, wanderers, and those who believed that wisdom was a kind of divinity in itself. Out of this restless search was born the Greek philosophy, the first great conversation between man and the universe, reason and faith, the body and the soul. Before the Greeks, most civilizations accepted the world as the will of gods. The Greeks, however, dared to believe that the human mind could grasp the laws that governed all things. In Miletus, thinkers like Thales looked beyond myth, claiming that the world was made of elements, not divine whim. He pointed to water as the essence of life, marking the first step toward science. Anaximander spoke of the apeiron, the infinite that lay beyond all creation, a mystery not of gods, but of existence itself. These early philosophers were dreamers of logic, peering through the veil of myth to glimpse the order beneath chaos. Then came Socrates, the barefoot philosopher who walked the streets of Athens, questioning everyone and everything. He owned no wealth, wrote no books, and yet changed the course of human thought. The unexamined life, he said, is not worth living. To Socrates, wisdom began with admitting ignorance, and truth was something uncovered through dialogue and reflection. His death, drinking the cup of hemlock rather than betray his beliefs, became a symbol of intellectual freedom, the price of truth paid with calm defiance. His student Plato would immortalize him in words, transforming philosophy into literature and the pursuit of truth into an art form. In Plato's academy, thought took shape in the form of ideas, eternal, perfect realities behind the shadows of the physical world. To him, every object was merely a reflection of a higher truth. Justice, beauty, and love existed not as fleeting emotions, but as timeless forms. Through his writings, he built bridges between the tangible and the transcendent, teaching that the soul yearned to ascend from ignorance toward divine understanding. For Plato, knowledge was remembrance, the awakening of something eternal within us. But it was Aristotle, his student, who brought the heavens down to earth. Where Plato sought perfection beyond this world, Aristotle looked at the world itself and saw perfection in its workings. He dissected plants, studied animals, and cataloged the stars. To him, truth lay not in ideas, but in observation, in understanding the causes of things. He spoke of ethics as the practice of balance, the golden mean between extremes, and defined happiness not as pleasure, but as eudaimonia, the flourishing of the soul through reason and virtue. His words became the foundation of science, logic, and moral philosophy, shaping the structure of human thought for millennia. From these minds grew an entire garden of schools: the Stoics, who taught that peace lies in accepting fate; the Epicureans, who found joy in simplicity and friendship, and the Cynics, who rejected materialism in pursuit of truth. Each offered a different path to the same destination, harmony between the self and the cosmos. The Greeks believed that knowledge was not merely to be learned but lived, that wisdom meant aligning one's soul with the order of the universe. Their questions still linger in the air we breathe. Every debate on justice, every search for meaning, every attempt to balance emotion with reason carries the ghost of the Greek mind. When we ponder our place in the world, we walk once more through the agora, alongside the thinkers who first dared to ask why. In their pursuit of understanding, the Greeks revealed that the greatest journey was not across the seas, but within the human spirit. They taught that to live well was to live thoughtfully, to be aware, to seek truth, and to strive toward the good. And though the marble of their temples may have crumbled, their words endure, echoing softly across time. Know thyself. Long before the philosophers questioned truth, the Greeks looked to their heroes for meaning. These were not quiet thinkers in marble courtyards, but warriors whose names thundered across the ages: Achilles, Odysseus, Heracles, Perseus, and Theseus. They were mortals born of both flesh and legend, their lives stretched between the will of the gods and the frailty of men. To the Greeks, the heroic age was more than a collection of stories. It was a sacred mirror, reflecting what humanity could be when touched by divine fire and tested by fate. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were the foundation of Greek identity, half myth, half memory. In the Iliad, the walls of Troy gleamed under the relentless sun as heroes clashed for honor more than conquest. Achilles, the greatest of them all, stood as the embodiment of both glory and tragedy. His rage, his love for Patroclus, and his fateful heel became eternal symbols of human brilliance shadowed by mortality. He was a man destined to choose between a long, quiet life and brief, blazing immortality, and he chose the flame. In that choice, the Greeks saw the paradox of heroism, that greatness demanded sacrifice. The Odyssey, meanwhile, carried the story from the battlefield to the soul. Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, wandered seas haunted by gods and monsters, yearning only to return home. His trials, the siren's song, the Cyclops' cave, the wrath of Poseidon, were not just adventures, but allegories of the human journey. For the Greeks, Odysseus's voyage was the eternal struggle of man against chaos, reason against instinct, and home as the final victory of perseverance. The myths themselves were woven with the threads of morality and mystery. They taught that even the mightiest were bound by hubris, the arrogance that defied the gods. Those who flew too high, like Icarus, fell from the sky. Those who challenged fate, like Oedipus, found ruin in the very act of seeking truth. Each tale carried a warning, whispered through centuries, that wisdom lies in balance, and every gift bears a price. Yet the Greeks did not worship perfection. They revered the flawed, the striving, the tragic hero who knew his doom and walked toward it anyway. Across the land, from Mycenae's lion gates to Crete's labyrinth, myth and reality intertwined. The ruins that dotted the hills were believed to be the remnants of those ancient stories, stones once laid by heroes, tombs that held the ashes of demigods. The Greeks did not separate their past from their myths. They breathed life into them. Festivals were held in their honor, sacrifices made at their altars, and their stories carved into temple walls and sung by poets beneath the stars. Through these legends, the Greeks shaped their values. Bravery was not merely survival. It was facing destiny with dignity. Loyalty was sacred, deceit dangerous, and honor worth dying for. Women, too, held power within these tales, from the cunning Penelope, weaving and unweaving her fate, to the fierce Atalanta, who outran every suitor and fought beside heroes. Their presence reminded the Greeks that the divine feminine, whether nurturing or destructive, was woven into the very fabric of existence. In the end, the Age of Heroes was both history and dream. a reflection of a world that believed the gods walked beside men, that storms and wars were the language of Olympus. These myths were not escapism, but philosophy wrapped in poetry, exploring the questions of identity, morality, and destiny long before the philosophers gave them names. Even now, as centuries pass and the voices of the bards fade, the echo of those tales remains. We still speak of Achilles' rage, Odysseus's journey, and Icarus's fall, because within them lies something eternal, the human desire to transcend, to matter, to burn brightly against the darkness. As the mists of myth began to fade, a new dawn rose over the mountains and seas of Hellas, a world no longer ruled by heroes and gods, but by men. Villages turned into cities, and cities became polis, the Greek city-states that would form the beating heart of their civilization. Each polis was a world unto itself, a community bound not just by walls or soldiers, but by shared laws, temples, and the unshakable belief that freedom was sacred. In this age, the Greeks discovered something far greater than the sword. They discovered citizenship. No two cities embodied this transformation more vividly than Athens and Sparta, twin flames burning with opposite ideals. Athens, rising from the rocky hills of Attica, was a city of thinkers, builders, and dreamers. The Athenians believed in words as weapons, in debate as a battlefield. Here, in the shadow of the Acropolis, the seeds of democracy were sown, a bold experiment that declared the voice of the people, not the will of a king, should shape destiny. The agora, their public square, was alive with the hum of merchants, poets, and philosophers debating the meaning of justice beneath the open sky. But far to the south, beyond rugged mountains and river plains, stood Sparta, a city forged not in marble and philosophy, but in blood and discipline. The Spartans lived for one purpose: strength. From the moment a child was born, its life was devoted to the state. Weakness was discarded. Courage and obedience were sacred. Their society was a living army, their women bold, their men unyielding, their kings merely servants to the law of Lycurgus. In contrast to Athenian democracy, Sparta was ruled by order, austerity, and fearlessness. To them, freedom meant mastery over the self, a silence sharper than any blade. Between these two poles of Greek identity, Athens the free, Sparta the disciplined, the Greek world found its balance. Their rivalry would define an era, shaping art, politics, and warfare for centuries. The Athenians built temples and theaters, seeking beauty and truth. The Spartans drilled in fields of dust, preparing for war. Yet both believed in arete, the pursuit of excellence, the ideal that every act, whether in battle or debate, should be done with perfection and pride. Life within a polis was intimate and alive. Citizens gathered for festivals honoring the gods, where drama and devotion intertwined. The Panathenaic Games celebrated athleticism and art, echoing through the marble streets of Athens. Farmers and craftsmen worked side by side, while sailors looked to the Aegean, their ships stitching Greece together through trade and exploration. In the temples, smoke rose from sacrifices to Athena, Apollo, and Zeus, offerings to the divine patrons who watched over each city. But the polis was more than a place. It was an idea. It represented self-governance, shared destiny, an identity bound to one's community. To live outside it was to live without honor, without meaning. The Greeks did not see themselves as subjects of a kingdom, but as participants in a living, breathing organism of collective will. The city-state became their home, their pride, their battlefield, and sometimes their downfall. The rise of the polis marked the moment when human reason replaced divine decree as the driving force of history. The same people who once prayed to Zeus for victory now gathered in assembly halls to decide their own fates. The gods still reigned from Olympus, but men had learned to question, to choose, to lead. This awakening, fragile, imperfect, revolutionary, would ignite a fire that burned brighter than any myth. And yet, even in their greatness, the city-states were destined to clash. For beneath the brilliance of their temples and the harmony of their ideals, ambition stirred. Athens dreamed of empire. Sparta demanded obedience. And soon, the two would stand face to face, not as brothers, but as rivals in a war that would test the very soul of Greece. It began with a whisper carried by the winds of the Aegean, a whisper of invasion. Across the eastern horizon, beyond the blue waters and sunlit islands, lay the vast Persian Empire, a realm so immense that it seemed the gods themselves must have built it. From the deserts of Persia to the valleys of India, it stretched like a shadow over the ancient world. Its king, Darius I, ruled millions with an iron will and a divine claim. To the Persians, Greece was a mere scattering of quarrelsome tribes, a stubborn pebble in the path of empire. But to the Greeks, freedom was their soul, and no tyrant, no matter how distant, could command it. The first sparks of conflict flared in Ionia, on the western coast of Asia Minor, where Greek colonies chafed under Persian rule. When these cities rebelled, Athens and Eretria sent aid, a small gesture of defiance that would echo louder than they imagined. Darius vowed revenge. "Who are the Athenians?" he reportedly asked, and when told, he ordered a servant to whisper in his ear each day, "Master, remember the Athenians." That memory would soon take the shape of a fleet bound for Greece. In 490 BCE, the Persians landed at Marathon, a plain north of Athens. Facing them stood a much smaller force of Greek hoplites, farmers and citizens in bronze armor, fighting not for empire, but for their land and liberty. The Athenians, led by Miltiades, made a daring charge across the field. Their heavy shields and discipline shattered the Persian lines, sending the invaders fleeing to their ships. It was an astonishing victory, proof that courage and unity could defy the greatest power on earth. Legend says a messenger ran the entire 26 miles from Marathon to Athens to announce victory before collapsing, the origin of the modern marathon race. But the Persians were not defeated, only delayed. A decade later, Xerxes, the son of Darius, sought to avenge his father. His army was said to number in the hundreds of thousands, so vast that it drank rivers dry and darkened the sea with ships. Greece braced for annihilation. Yet in the face of fear, the city-states did something extraordinary. They united. Under the leadership of Sparta and Athens, a fragile alliance formed. For once, the quarrels of the polis were silenced by a common cause. At Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass, the Spartan king Leonidas and his 300 warriors stood against the tide. "Come and take them," he told the Persians when ordered to surrender their weapons. For 3 days, they held the pass, their shields locking together like a wall of bronze. They knew they would die, but their defiance became immortal, a symbol of sacrifice for freedom. When they fell, the Persians advanced, burning Athens and desecrating its temples. Yet the Greeks did not yield. On the sea near Salamis, the Athenians struck back. Using cunning and knowledge of the tides, Themistocles lured the massive Persian fleet into narrow straits where their numbers counted for nothing. The smaller, faster Greek triremes rammed and shattered the enemy's ships, turning the calm waters red with the wreckage of empire. It was a triumph of strategy over size, intellect over arrogance. Soon after, at Plataea, the united Greek army dealt the final blow, ending Persia's dream of Europe. The Persian Wars changed everything. For the first time, the Greeks saw themselves not just as Athenians or Spartans, but as Hellenes, one people bound by blood, language, and faith in freedom. The victory was not merely military, it was spiritual. The East had been held at bay, and the idea of liberty, fragile, precious, and defiant, had survived. Yet from that triumph would come new tensions. Athens emerged powerful, its navy unmatched, its pride swelling. Sparta, ever wary, watched from afar. The alliance that saved Greece began to fracture. And in the ashes of Persian ships, another fire began to burn. The fire of rivalry, ambition, and destiny that would soon ignite the greatest civil war the Greek world had ever known. The smoke of war faded into the Aegean breeze, and in its place rose the glitter of Athens, reborn from ashes into a city of marble and light. The Persian threat had been driven back, but victory had done more than save Greece. It had transformed her. The gods, it seemed, had granted the Athenians a new destiny, to build a world not of conquest, but of mind, beauty, and freedom. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens entered what would become known as its Golden Age, a time when human thought reached heights never seen before, and the city stood as a beacon to the world. Pericles was no king, though his influence rivaled one. He was a statesman of vision, calm, deliberate, and unshakable in his belief that the greatness of a city lay not in its walls or armies, but in its citizens. The whole earth, he said, is the tomb of heroic men, and their story is told not only on stone but in the hearts of free people. Under his rule, democracy blossomed. Every citizen, rich or poor, had a voice in the assembly. Decisions were made not by decree, but by debate. Ideas clashed like spears in a new kind of battlefield, the battlefield of reason. And from this freedom came art. On the rocky plateau of the Acropolis, the Athenians built temples that seemed to breathe, none greater than the Parthenon, a crown of white marble dedicated to Athena, goddess of wisdom and protector of the city. Its columns rose like frozen waves, balanced with mathematical perfection, glowing golden in the sunlight. Inside, a colossal statue of Athena stood draped in gold and ivory, her gaze serene yet fierce. Every chisel mark, every curve of marble, was a hymn to human skill, a declaration that the divine could be captured in form and proportion. The city became an open-air school for the soul. Sculptors like Phidias shaped gods and heroes so lifelike they seemed ready to step down from their pedestals. Playwrights filled the theaters with words that echoed like thunder. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides turned myth into morality, weaving tales of pride, fate, and the fragile nature of humanity. In the open air of the theater of Dionysus, thousands gathered beneath the sky to watch tragedy unfold, to feel, together, the weight of joy and loss. And in the marketplaces and courtyards, another revolution was unfolding, the birth of philosophy. Here walked Socrates, barefoot and unbending, asking questions that cut deeper than any sword. What is virtue, he would ask? What is justice? What does it mean to live well? His students, among them Plato, listened and argued, their minds ignited by his relentless pursuit of truth. From these conversations grew the roots of Western thought, the idea that knowledge, not power, was the truest form of greatness. But the beauty of Athens was not merely intellectual. It was human. Music, dance, and poetry filled the air. Ships brought treasures from every shore, and festivals lit the city with laughter and song. Life itself became an art form, a balance between body and spirit, discipline and pleasure. To be Athenian was to believe in the potential of mankind, to see humanity as capable of approaching the divine through reason and creation. Yet beneath the marble and philosophy, shadows lingered. The city's splendor was built upon the labor of others, slaves, allies, and the conquered. Athens had grown powerful, and with power came pride. Her democracy, though radiant, was fragile. Her citizens, though free, were often divided. Even Pericles, wise as he was, could not silence the murmurs of resentment that grew among Greece's other cities. Still, in this moment, this brief, golden heartbeat of history, the world had never seen anything like it. Art, politics, philosophy, and science stood hand in hand beneath the Attic sun. The Parthenon gleamed. The thinkers spoke. The people dreamed. And from that dream, the very foundations of Western civilization were laid, enduring long after the voices of Athens fell silent. The age of harmony was brief, like the glow of a sunset fading into storm. Beneath the marble brilliance of Athens lay seeds of envy, fear, and pride. To the south, Sparta watched with quiet disdain as Athens rose higher, its fleets mastering the seas, its wealth spreading like sunlight over the Aegean. To the Spartan mind, forged in the discipline of iron and silence, The Athenians had become arrogant, intoxicated by their own freedom, their own art, their own talk of democracy. And so, as the gods watched from Olympus, the two greatest cities of Greece began to drift toward war. Not against barbarians this time, but against themselves. It began in whispers. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta deepened with each passing year, their allies drawn into two great camps. On one side, the Delian League, led by Athens, whose ships patrolled every corner of the Mediterranean, carrying tribute from distant islands. On the other, the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, bound by discipline and ancient pride. The tension was like a taut bowstring, stretched by ambition and fear. When the spark came, a minor conflict in a far-off colony, it ignited the most devastating war the Greek world had ever known. The Peloponnesian War would last nearly 30 years, a slow unraveling of everything Greece had built. At first, Athens seemed unstoppable. Its navy ruled the sea. Its walls, stretching from the city to its port at Piraeus, made it nearly impregnable. Pericles urged his people to endure, to stay behind their walls and let their ships bring supplies. But the gods, it seemed, had turned their faces away. As war dragged on, plague swept through the city, a silent, unseen enemy. Thousands perished in the narrow streets, their bodies burned in pyres that smoked beneath the Acropolis. Even Pericles himself fell to the sickness, and with him died the steady wisdom that had guided Athens through its glory. Without his hand, chaos grew. The people turned to demagogues, fiery voices promising victory, revenge, salvation. They voted for bold campaigns and reckless wars. Nicias, cautious and pious, warned against overreach, but was ignored. Then came Alcibiades, brilliant, beautiful, and dangerously ambitious. A man who embodied both the brilliance and arrogance of his city. He persuaded Athens to invade Sicily, dreaming of empire across the western seas. It was a disaster. The Athenian fleet was annihilated, its soldiers captured or slain, their dreams buried in the foreign soil of Syracuse. As years passed, the balance of power shifted. Sparta, aided by Persian gold, built a navy to challenge Athens at sea. One by one, Athenian allies rebelled. Famine and despair crept through the once mighty city. At last, in 404 BCE, the inevitable came. Spartan troops marched into a starving Athens. Its walls were torn down, its fleet was burned, its democracy briefly replaced by tyranny. The torch that had once lit the world flickered and dimmed. Yet even in defeat, the spirit of Greece did not vanish. The war had broken bodies and cities, but not the power of its ideas. The philosophers still spoke, the playwrights still wrote. The lessons of that war, of pride, freedom, and the fragility of human greatness, would echo through the centuries, whispered wherever nations rose and fell. It is said that when the Spartan general Lysander entered Athens, he found its people silent, their heads bowed before the ruins of their glory. But in that silence, there remained something unconquerable, the memory of what they had been. For though Sparta had triumphed in battle, it was Athens, the dreamer, the thinker, the artist, that would live forever in the minds of men. The war between Athens and Sparta was not merely a conflict of arms. It was a tragedy of the human spirit, a tale of how brilliance can destroy itself when consumed by rivalry and pride. And when the smoke cleared, Greece was forever changed, weakened, divided, and vulnerable to a new power rising in the north. When the fires of the Peloponnesian War finally faded, Greece lay exhausted, a mosaic of proud but broken city-states, each clinging to memories of lost glory. The temples still shone in the sunlight, but behind their marble facades were ruins of ambition, betrayal, and despair. The philosophers still debated the meaning of virtue in the shadowed courtyards of Athens, yet their city was no longer the beating heart of empire. Sparta, victorious in name, found itself unable to rule what it had conquered. The soil of Greece, rich in blood and legend, had grown weary of endless war. And from the rugged hills of the north, where wild winds swept over pine and mountain, a new power began to rise, one that would unite Greece under a single banner for the first time. Its name was Macedon. The Macedonians had long been dismissed by the southern Greeks as semi-barbarians, hardy shepherds, and horsemen who lived beyond the frontiers of true civilization. Yet within this land of warriors and kings, destiny was stirring. In the city of Pella, a young prince named Philip watched the chaos of the Greek world unfold. He had spent his youth as a hostage in Thebes, observing firsthand the discipline of the Theban army and the brilliance of their general, Epaminondas. When Philip returned home, he brought with him not resentment, but knowledge that would soon transform his kingdom from a northern outpost into a superpower. Through cunning, diplomacy, and ruthlessness, Philip set about reforging Macedon. He reorganized the army, creating the Macedonian phalanx, a formidable formation of long spears, drilled soldiers, and unbreakable unity. He expanded his borders, subdued rival tribes, and filled his treasury with gold from the mines of Thrace. Yet it was not brute strength alone that set him apart. Philip was a master strategist, wielding marriage, persuasion, and deception as weapons as sharp as any sword. He married into neighboring dynasties, made allies of former enemies, and played the Greek city-states against one another with the patience of a chess master. To Athens and Thebes, he presented himself as a liberator, a restorer of peace after generations of bloodshed. To others, he was a conqueror cloaked in diplomacy. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his influence crept southward. While the Greeks argued in their assemblies, Philip built roads, armies, and alliances. By the time they recognized the danger, Macedon had become the most powerful state in the Hellenic world. In 338 BCE, the moment of reckoning arrived. The armies of Athens and Thebes, once bitter enemies, united in desperation to halt Philip's advance. They met at Chaeronea, a battlefield that would decide the fate of Greece. There, the Macedonian phalanx stood like an iron wall, unmoving against the storm. At Philip's side fought his teenage son, Alexander, whose eyes burned with a ferocity that even his father found unsettling. When the dust settled, the old Greece, of city-states and rivalries, lay shattered. Philip was now the master of all Greece. Yet his vision was not of conquest alone. He dreamed of uniting the Hellenes in a grand crusade, a war not against each other, but against Persia, the ancient enemy that had once threatened their freedom. For the first time, Greece stood on the brink of unity, bound not by love but by necessity, under the banner of Macedon. At Corinth, the city-states swore allegiance to Philip as hegemon, leader of a pan-Hellenic league. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless, a calm before the storm that would soon sweep across continents. But fate is cruel to dreamers. Before his great campaign could begin, Philip was struck down, assassinated during a festival, his life ending in a flash of blood and betrayal. Some said it was vengeance, others whispered conspiracy, but whatever the truth, the world trembled at what came next. For his son, Alexander, stood ready to inherit not only a kingdom, but a dream that would carry Greece beyond its mountains, across deserts and empires, to the very edge of the known world. The torches of the palace flickered that night in Pella, their flames dancing on the marble walls. Outside, the winds of destiny stirred once more. Greece had fallen, but from its ashes, something greater had risen, a vision that would not be confined by the Aegean or by mortal ambition. The age of city-states had ended. The age of empires had begun. When the blade struck down Philip II in the theater of Aegae, the air itself seemed to still. The crowd gasped, the music halted, and a dream that had taken decades to forge hung suspended in silence. Amid the chaos, one figure did not tremble, the young Prince Alexander, 20 years old, born of royal blood and divine rumor. His mother, Olympus, claimed descent from Achilles and whispered that Zeus himself was his father. Whether myth or madness, Alexander believed it, and that belief became his armor. That night, as his father's body was carried away by torchlight, the new king stood before the Macedonian army. His voice did not waver. "My father is dead," he declared, "but his dream will live through me." From that moment, the world shifted. Alexander was no mere ruler. He was a storm contained within human form, brilliant, reckless, insatiable. Trained by Aristotle, he spoke of virtue and philosophy. Yet his heart belonged to conquest. His mind burned with visions of glory, of banners unfurling beneath foreign suns, of cities bearing his name rising from the dust. He inherited from Philip not just an empire, but a purpose, to bring Greece together under one will and lead it eastward against the great Persian Empire. But before he could claim Asia, he had to claim Greece. Some cities rebelled upon hearing of Philip's death, thinking the Macedonian grip had weakened. They were wrong. Alexander moved with terrifying speed, marching south, his army a force of precision and fury. Thebes, bold and defiant, dared to challenge him. Within days, the city was surrounded. When it fell, Alexander made an example so brutal that its memory would echo through history. The walls torn down, its people enslaved, its name struck from the earth. The message was clear. The dream of Macedon would not die with Philip. It had found a vessel far more dangerous. With Greece subdued, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait that divided Europe and Asia, and paused at the shore of Troy, where legend said Achilles had fought. He ran his fingers over the ruins, whispering a silent vow to his heroic ancestor. Then, with one sweeping gesture, he hurled a spear into Asian soil and proclaimed, "From this land, I claim my empire." It was both audacity and prophecy. The Persian Empire that awaited him was vast, a world of satraps, palaces, and endless legions. Yet Alexander believed himself destined to surpass it. At the Battle of the Granicus, he faced the Persian cavalry head-on, defying all counsel, plunging into the river first, his white plume flashing beneath the arrows. His men followed, inspired by the sight of their king charging like a god of war. Victory was swift and bloody. City after city fell. Sardis, Halicarnassus, and the lands of Asia Minor bent the knee. But it was at Issus, in 333 BCE, that Alexander's legend truly began. Facing the Persian king Darius III and an army many times the size of his own, Alexander's tactics and unrelenting will shattered the enemy line. When Darius fled, leaving behind his chariot, his treasures, and even his family, the world saw that the unthinkable had happened. The boy from Macedon had humbled the might of Persia. The march continued, through deserts and mountains, across the Fertile Crescent, into Egypt, where the priests hailed him as a god. There, he founded Alexandria, the city that would one day outshine empires. And always, behind his victories, trailed the same relentless purpose, not just to conquer, but to unite. He spoke of merging East and West, of blending the blood of nations into one civilization, a dream as vast and dangerous as the world itself. Yet even as he rose, shadows followed. His victories fed his pride fed his isolation. Friends became rivals, rivals became ghosts. The deeper he marched into Asia, the more distant he became from the Greece that birthed him. He began to believe not that he served the gods, but that he was one. Still, in this moment, at the height of his youth and power, Alexander stood unchallenged, a figure of light and fire, a living myth. His armies carved history into the mountains and deserts of the world, and behind him, Greece, fractured, battered, yet immortal, watched its sun ascend beyond mortality.